A young man was running through some abandoned area at night. The young man was very tired, and the sweat was already pouring off him in hailstones, and he was breathing heavily. After a while, the guy was tied up and locked in a back room. They wanted to use him as bait for monsters. Up ahead, he spotted an abandoned house and decided he could hide there and wait out the danger. There was a suggestion from him to kick Yunwen out so the others could run to another building while the guy— At that moment, the brunette realized that he was most likely going to die once again. He didn't understand where so much blood could have come from, and eventually he threw up. After a moment, he looked up and saw a scary and strange man in front of him. The scariest thing was that this big man was holding a chainsaw and was going to kill the young man with it. From horror, the guy froze on the spot, and to run from the maniac, he simply did not have the strength. So he fell on his knees and began to beg the man for mercy, for he knew nothing. Plus, he promised that he would do anything the stranger asked, just so long as the stranger didn't kill him. The scary man left, and the young man realized that he was kneeling in the middle of the auditorium and that it was all just a normal nightmare. Shaitan made the decision to untie the brunette, but also asked him to keep his hands loose and not try to strangle him anymore. At this point, the guy realized that this was exactly what he had forgotten to do, so he decided to rectify the situation immediately. The young man began to look for the final version of his work in his belongings, and he projected it onto the board, except he went a little overboard with the presentation. In the end, it was also part of the young man's dream. He realized this when he fell out of bed, hit his back, and woke up. He woke up before his alarm clock rang. His report materials were on his desk, and he had studied so hard that now he was having nightmares like this. 10 days before these events, Jong Hoen spent all his time studying and preparing his report, while the rest of the students were relaxing, throwing parties, and traveling. Nevertheless, he had finished his report and slept for 3 whole days, and now he looked to see that the room was full of empty energy bottles that he had been hanging on to the whole time. Even though he might have gotten sick, it was more expensive to piss off the professor, but his mood was a little spoiled by the nightmare he'd had today. At that moment, the boy remembered that today was Christmas. The older man didn't understand why Hoen was doing and saying all this, but then he saw his crying. He wondered what the other students who stayed in the dorm were doing now, except that the room looked strangely empty and mystically scary. Hoen didn't understand why everywhere was so untidy and also so quiet. Yenwan, on the other hand, could not let his friend die, so he asked him to give up the failed scheme. The guy got really scared and tried to turn on his phone and call, but as soon as he turned on his phone, he noticed a sea of unread messages. At this point, the colonel looked over the protagonist and immediately ordered Liv to immediately summon an airplane. Hoen didn't understand at all what was going on, and there was no signal either, so he decided to go into the store and ask what was going on at the university. At first, he thought no one was here either, but then someone came out to his call. The guy decided to get close to the man. He asked the man to call the police and report a dead body in the dormitory, except this man was eating another man and didn't look quite normal and alive. Hoen realized he was in a dangerous situation and needed to get his feet out of here, but he couldn't take a step out of fear. The guy didn't have the ability or desire to think long. Seeing someone eating another person, he started running away from the danger. I changed clothes and went down the hallway to get an axe to kill zombies as I went. The situation was so bad and the enemy was not going to leave the young man alone. So he grabbed the goods from the shelf and threw them at the pursuer. Except it didn't work on them, and the guy was starting to realize that his business was bad, and he was being pursued by people far from human. Hoen suddenly realized that the girl who had been bitten had also turned into a monster. Now these 2 monsters started chasing the young man, who started running away from the store. After that, the older man walked over to the brown-haired man. He was glad he hadn't died on the way. Suddenly, the girls stopped and stopped banging on the door. Nevertheless, the lad realized that he needed to run again. His heart was pounding frantically, and his feet led themselves to the auditorium where he was trying to find his teacher. But there was no one there either, except for a note that said that if the young man wanted to live, he should be quiet so as not to wake the monsters. It was the strangest possible remark and situation, so he didn't understand anything. Hoen stood looking at the duct-tape door for a while, and the moment someone tried to open it, the guy started running from the premises. He realized now that he shouldn't have yelled, and should be quiet as the door was opened and new monsters began to come out of there. Hoen had made it almost to the last floor, and it was clear that there was nowhere else to run. The young man had no more strength to run and froze on the stairs, while a new monster was already catching up with him. However, the guy realized that he couldn't stand still. He needed to keep moving no matter how scared he was. At that moment, he noticed a man up ahead, hiding his face behind a mask and holding a bat. The stranger stood up, and Hoenn realized that he didn't look like a monster, so he decided to talk to him. The man did not hurry to answer, but took and threw an axe at the monster, which appeared behind the young man's back and hit him directly in the head. The stranger started to approach Hoenn and said he thought the guy was already dead. The situation was getting more and more frightening, because the brown-haired man had never seen a brunette in his life. At that moment, he even imagined him being hugged tightly by the colonel, while the guy is at his place of work. Except that Hoenn didn't really recognize the man in front of him. At that moment, the man took off his mask and said he was Ki En-won, so it was surprising to him that Hoenn pretended not to know him. The young man tried to remember where he could have met this handsome guy, because his appearance was quite remarkable, and screamed that he was definitely not a nerd and quiet. But the problem was that he still couldn't remember the brunette, and given his appearance, he realized that if he had met him, he wouldn't have forgotten. But here was what Hoenn was well aware of. This man could hardly be called normal, for he never put the axe away, but continued to hold it in his hands. And then the brunette took and pinned Hoenn against the wall. Yoon-won didn't understand why the younger man was trying to get away from him. Had he done something wrong? The brunette thought Hoenn was doing it because he was afraid it would kill him. Except why would he do that? Plus, he wasn't the one who forgot the other person's name and made that person look sick. Hoenn realized he was in trouble, so he began to beg the brunette's forgiveness for failing to acknowledge his elder. Ki En-won was silent, and Hoenn thought it might not be too late to try and escape. So, they returned to their mini-base in the library and began to scrutinize the diagram of the university on the The man added that it was extremely dangerous for them to stay here, as the undead were about to rush in because of the Shaitan's shrieks. They were walking away from the dormitory, and Hoenn still couldn't figure out what had happened in the 3 days he had slept in his room. How quite normal people could turn into such an incomprehensible thing in such a short time, and how many people were left alive here. Yes, and the brunette acted as if they had known each other for a long, long time, which was odd too. After all, they had essentially met today for the first time in their lives. But most of all, he couldn't understand how he could behave so calmly in such a situation. After all, he was indifferently, calmly, and in cold blood killing those who were human even yesterday. Yenwon noticed that the younger man was thinking about something and said again that he wouldn't kill him, or even if he wanted to, he wouldn't be able to. So they could not waste any more time and walk so slowly. So the man approached the boy and asked him to take his hand. Hoenn didn't dare to take the stranger's hand, so he did it himself. And the brown-haired man suddenly noticed that the man's hand was covered with calluses, and then they ran forward. Hoenn didn't like this situation and started making noise again, saying that he could escape on his own. He didn't need to hold hands to do so, but the brunette knew perfectly well that if he let go of the young man's hand, he would fall back, fall down and cry. But Hoenn didn't think so. After a while, they did make it to a less normal and safe place. Hoenn's hand was burning with hellfire, and he didn't understand where the stranger got so much power from. Meanwhile, the man closed the door and said that by all accounts the monsters had captured another human. Yenwon didn't believe they were going to the main gate, but the brown-haired man confirmed the information. Hoenn didn't understand why they wouldn't help someone who was in trouble and asked for their help. The man began to plead with them even harder, and Hoenn was ready to open the door, but Yenwon stopped him. The brunette, unlike the châtain, was well aware that the man behind the door couldn't be helped and was just another snack for the monster. This information didn't reach the brown-haired man's brain, so Yoon-won said that for monsters, humans are food, so they catch and eat them. So now it's every man for himself. You can't go along with your feelings, because if you hesitate, you'll be eaten to the bone. At this point, someone heard them and started asking them to open the door and hide him. The brunette didn't have time to react before Hoenn rushed to the door and started to open it. Still, at the last minute, he was able to intercept the Shaitan's arm, but the man started to say that if they didn't hurry, a man might die because of them. Hoenn couldn't realize that there were more than 1 or 2 monsters behind the doors, but he couldn't close his eyes to the fact that someone was asking for their help. The man realized that words wouldn't help here, and he picked the guy up and threw him to the floor away from the door. He then leaned over to the guy and asked him to stop with his ideals and listen to him carefully, as he wouldn't last a minute without his help. Suddenly, the guy decided to ask the brunette how he knew his name. Yenwon got angry, covered the guy's mouth with his hand, and asked him about whether he really wanted to die. After which, he suggested that Hoenn kill him himself on the spot, since the guy didn't like him anyway. The older one felt that the situation wouldn't change dramatically if he killed the younger one once. At that moment, they heard the screams of the girl who was caught by the monsters. Once the monsters had had enough and left, the brunette figured they could open the door and go about their business. Hoenn didn't understand what had changed. For not so long ago, the brunette himself had forbidden them to open the door to the room. The man smiled. He knew his junior was an excellent student, but for some reason his mind was too tight right now. Hoenn, on the other hand, felt that if they were going to cowardly hide, they'd better stay here, since water, electricity, and walls were in place. With one kick, the man kicked the door open and asked if the man really wanted to hide in this wreck, and suggested he call the monsters to a pajama party. It wasn't that far to the building, so the brunette asked his friend to only run forward and not to look back. If that was the case, they should have gotten out of here before the monsters moved away, because they didn't have any special intelligence, and if they found prey, they weren't interested in anything else. At this point, it came to Hoenn's attention that his new acquaintance was using that man as bait. The brunette, however, thought that the guy was at fault, as he was yelling all over the hallway, and that's why he got caught by the monsters, so he shouldn't be reflexive about it. After that, they went out into the corridor and walked on. Hoenn asked the older man why he had taken him with him. After all, he was no more than ballast. Shaitan thought for a long moment, then assumed the man would feed him to the monsters if he got the chance, so that he himself could survive. Despite his very imposing and formidable appearance, the first thing the guy did was ask the protagonists to give him permission to hug them. Hoenn had the impression that he was in some horror movie that never ended, and here they came to another audience. In truth, they had come to the communal shower room, which was the only place to get away from the monsters. The brown-haired man's assumptions were correct. It turned out that athletes from different universities had a joint training session. At this moment, Yunwan looked at the brown-haired man and asked how one could be so stupid. He then lifted the lid on the lock and entered the password. Shaitan was shocked that the brunette was able to open the door more than the monsters, since only the commandant should have known the password. There were other people in the shower room, however, who froze and looked at the people who entered. Hoenn noticed that all the people in the shower room were hostile, so he started saying that he wasn't a monster, but a very ordinary person. The guy who wanted to hit them with a chair asked how they managed to get here. The man with the bat summarized Hoenn's story by revealing that the man had been sleeping in his room the whole time, and Unwon had gotten the password to the shower in the receptionist's room. Except that no one believed their heartwarming story. It was hard to believe that someone could have been so sound asleep to not notice all the chaos that was going on around them. Afterward, Jusok asked the brunette where he had been walking all this time. Yunwan wasn't going to answer any questions, so he said he didn't remember anything, period. Hoenn admitted he didn't expect to see such organization, and the group leader wondered how things were in other buildings. In response, the brunette did the same, but only with his bloody axe. The man was thus showing that he was in charge and told Jusok to choose his words when speaking to him. Hoenn realized that his new acquaintance might as well kill Jusok, so he approached him and asked him to silently put down the axe. Shaitan admitted that their story looked a little ridiculous, but it was exactly as they said, for there was no point in lying in such a situation. Also, Hoenn said that although his friend looks like a thug, he's a good kid, and then asked to get into their situation. With difficulty, but Hoenn managed to quiet the other students. Suddenly, Choi Dabin recognized Jong Hoenn, because they had once worked in the same group in freshman year. After a while, the guy recognized her and also apologized because he couldn't do it sooner, because she had changed her hair. Also in the shower room was freshman Park Gonu from the math department, and Juseok from the final year of administrative management. Then she bowed to the brunette and said they hadn't seen each other in a while. The girl admitted that she did not expect to meet a man in such a place and under such circumstances. Hoenn didn't expect Dabin to know the brunette, and the woman said it was Ki Yunwan from the sculpture department. Hoenn hadn't expected that his new acquaintance had actually gone to uni with them. Shaitan reflected on the fact that the brunette went to lectures and studied like everyone else. But for some reason, there was a strange feeling inside about it. Dabin was well aware that the three of them had been very lucky to sneak into the shower room and sit there quietly all this time. But the other students were probably already dead. It turned out that the monsters, though they couldn't see well, were overly sensitive to sounds, and since the guy slept all the time, that's why he survived. Suddenly, Hoenn asked if anyone had tried to get out into the street and try to call or text someone from there, since there was no cell service or internet. Dabin and Gonu glanced over and asked the brown-haired man if he really didn't know anything. They realized that the guy really didn't know anything and asked him to go to the window and look, and there were crowds of monsters walking around the yard, so they couldn't get out of here. This was something Hoenn really didn't expect to see. It was a perfect winter, sunny day, but there were mobs of monsters walking around the yard, and the asphalt was strewn with corpses and painted with blood splatters. The point was that they were locked in the shower room, and if they got out, at best, they would reach another building. But there was no chance of reaching the gate. Suddenly, Gonu asked Hoenn if he had stopped by the convenience store on the first floor. The boy described his girlfriend and asked if the young man had seen her, for she and the others had gone down to the store just then. But there had been no news of her since. Right now, Hanbin couldn't lead them into the lobby as he had other things to do. Suddenly, they were interrupted by Yenwon and told that they had a visitor. Hoenn also heard a very strange sound from outside. Someone would enter the password incorrectly and then ask to be let in because they were too hot. Gonu recognized the voice of his acquaintance. The guy wanted to open the door, but the brunette stopped him. Jusok was sure it was the people, who had earlier gone to get food at the store downstairs. The older man insisted that Gonu open the door for his girlfriend. Except this time, it was already Hoenn who asked to slow down. Yenwon thought that whoever was behind the door was hardly still human. He was especially unsure if that person would remain human once indoors. The girl outside the door begged Gona to let her in as she was scared and in pain. The mathematician couldn't stand it and opened the door, except that the people behind the door weren't quite people anymore. And then the monster slipped his hand through and swung the door open. But Yenwon intervened in time, cutting off the monster's arm and started to close the door. Afterward, he slammed the door shut and Jusok called him crazy and asked him what he had just done and why. The brunette gawked at the man and said that what stood outside the door was no longer human. Unwon shoved Jusok away as he was already in a bad mood, and the man was making it worse as he didn't shine with intelligence. Then the brunette stepped away from the door and said that Jusok could open it, except he wouldn't save him from death. Realizing that the student would not do so, Unwon said that in that case, he went to wash up. At that moment, the girl asked Hoenn how he knew Ki Unwon. Truth be told, the guy didn't know what to say to her, so he said they met on the way here and acted together. She thought that this situation was strange, because this guy was very popular in his faculty, but for some reason he was now a bit like that guy. After which, the brown man learned a very interesting story about a guy he only found out about today. The time for talking was over as they arrived at the 4th floor. Unwon and Hoenn, like the rest of the guys, decided to check out the different rooms. Hoenn was the first one unlucky enough to run into the monster, so he didn't hesitate to hit it over the head with the bat. Husoku didn't like that the two students were having a long conversation about the brunette. It annoyed him, and he asked them to stop doing it. And then, to be more convincing, he threw an empty pack of cigarettes at the brown-haired man's head. This man obviously didn't see the edges, because he said he sent Eugene downstairs to get cigarettes and she was incapable of bringing him even one pack. He'd assumed from the start that he'd be left without cigarettes when she was still coming out of the shower room, crying bitterly and sniffling her nose. Dabin Rashila interceded for her friend, saying that the older man himself had seen perfectly well that the girl was sick, but had insisted that she go anyway, so he had no right to say such things now. Jusok denied his guilt, for he believed that both Dabin and Gonu were also guilty, but pretended they had nothing to do with it. The girl reminded the man that Gonu had offered to replace Eugene back then, but it was Juseok who had persisted with that, saying that there would be no exceptions for anyone. He asked the boys if they still thought it was all a game. He didn't care about the personal circumstances of the young people, because here everyone's life hung in the balance and no one would coddle anyone. The man caught angry and judgmental looks and then said that you don't get to cry and suffer and say it won't work out here, and if you do, you're the weak link. Heihen decided to lower the degree a bit in the shower and asked the man to tone it down a bit. To calm the man down a bit, the brown-haired man offered him 1 cigarette each, since he'd grabbed his own when he left the room. They moved away from the others and started smoking. The man accused the younger ones of not having seen life and teaching him how to act. Shaitan didn't say anything to that, as he thought the older man was basically talking nonsense. Suddenly, Hoenn caught himself thinking that it had been so long since he had smoked that he had almost forgotten how to do it. After a couple puffs, the guy asked the man to stop being mad at the others, because everyone was on edge now. Besides, the guy was well aware that a split in the group was not conducive to survival, and it wasn't clear how long they could last on campus. He persuaded the man not to fight with the children as he was above it. Suddenly, Jusok voiced a thought that had occurred to Hoenn himself recently as well. He asked the guy if he thought they were in a situation that resembled a horror movie. Hoen was tied up and led under escort to a separate room, but he could not remember when he was wounded. Jusok also believed that all zombie movies have their own canons and rules. Oddly enough, the first was that in movies like this, the first couples to die were the ostensible ones. Hoen froze, not believing his ears, and the man said that Eugene had already died. Now it was Gonu's turn. When he died, it would be the capricious Burden's turn, and it all made him feel calmer at heart. Shaitan did not like to interfere and preferred a quiet life, but it was too much even for him, and the guy said that he had also heard about such laws, but only their information was radically different. As soon as Hoen got a chance to speak, he began to chase the brunette away, as he didn't want to hurt him. The man didn't expect someone to say something like that to his face. Once Hoen calmed down a bit, the older man kissed him affectionately, but Jusok had trouble controlling his emotions and understanding humor, so he grabbed the marquis by the pecs and painfully slammed the man into the wall. He wronged Hoen in vain as he instantly received a strong punch to the jaw from Yenwon. Hoen didn't expect anyone to do such a thing for him, and Yenwon threw a few more punches at his opponent and he bent in half. As a result, the brunette knocked out several of his opponent's teeth, causing him to bleed. Yenwon looked menacingly at Jusoku, and then said that his friend had said he was joking. Suddenly, Jusok called the brunette hurtful words, for which he received another fist on his teeth. After that, Yenwon let go of the man and the man fell to his knees in front of him. After a while, the plane with the heroes arrived at the second base. Then Liv wanted to wake up the main character, but the colonel told the girl not to wake him up and allowed. At that moment, he did not want to die alone. He wanted to hear at least once more the voices. What caught the young man's particular attention was the scar on the older man's neck. Meanwhile, the brunette pointed at his lips and said that Jusok should smile immediately and not turn the atmosphere into an incomprehensible mess. Instead of smiling, the man was crying and his blood was dripping onto the floor. The brunette, on the other hand, looked coldly at Jusok, and the latter had already called his assailant a real psychopath. Now the situation was repeating itself. The boys had been sleeping on the floor of the closet for some time. After all, he looked at every scar and didn't understand where they could all have come from on the older man's body. The question was that a normal person could hardly survive even a couple of such wounds. At that moment, Dabin and Gonu ran into the room, for they had heard the rumbling and decided to see what had happened. The girl had not expected to see such a very unusual picture. Hoen sighed heavily, for he was well aware that all his efforts had collapsed, and something had to be done again. It was sad to realize that the situation was as bad as it could get. Jusok left the corridor, followed by Dabin and Gonu, but the man waved them off, while Hoen pondered the fact that not only could they not leave the university, but they couldn't even get out of the shower room. It was obvious that sitting on their asses was also a bad option, because it was unlikely that anyone would come and rescue them. Suddenly, the brunette asked the younger man if he had been startled a few minutes ago when the brown-haired man slammed his back against the wall. Shaitan looked at Unwon and realized that while everyone was nervous, only the brunette remained indifferent and calm. Shaitan admitted. Not that he wasn't scared, but not to say he wasn't surprised at all. The older man admitted that he couldn't help it when Jusok decided to hurt Hoen. So he flared up. Strangely, here Hoen understood why the guy had acted this way. The brunette, on the other hand, doubted it, so he looked questioningly at the guy next to him. Hoen smiled. Behind that smile, he tried to hide the fact that he wouldn't be able to understand Yvonne. The point was that a normal person would not be able to understand the way of thinking of an abnormal person. Yet he replied that of course he did. Only to go further than kissing the boys were prevented by a knock on the door. Someone was trying to open it, so Unwon rallied to defend his youngest. The doors to the closet opened and Hanbin walked in, who was being strangled by Unwon. Only his attempt failed and made things worse, for the brunette had said there was no point in apologizing when the man didn't realize he'd done the wrong thing. For in that moment, the brown-haired man realized that he felt like a bastard for constantly hurting the one he loved. So at this point, Hoen decided to save what he needed to do to get the man to forgive him and stop resenting him. The brunette didn't bother to answer, just rested his head on the brown-haired man's shoulder. Afterward, Yunwon admitted that he was just too hard right now, so he asked Hoen to comfort him a little and rubbed his nose against his shoulder. Except Hoen had no idea how he could comfort the man beside him. The man turned to the brown-haired man, moved closer to his face, and exhaled a breath that he could comfort him with his body. Except Yunwon had other plans, as he realized that there were guys outside the door who were eavesdropping on their the situation. The words sounded the strangest. Hoen started to shake, and the brunette smiled and said that the brown-haired man looked very nice. Nevertheless, he wouldn't eat him. Chungmin stared at the bitten Hoen and didn't understand why the guy was fine and still alive. Yenwon looked at Hoen and asked him what he was up to, and he said he could tell him everything. The brunette showed the younger man an obscene gesture, the meaning of which Hoen immediately understood. But he was surprised that the man was so confident in his charms and skills. After that, the brunette laughed. Then Yunwon hugged Hoen and asked if they could sit like this for a while, just this one time. The young man didn't understand why this brunette was behaving this way only to him. At that moment, the guy suddenly realized that Yunwon was confusing him with someone else, as his words and actions were directed as if at someone else. However, Hoen suddenly thought to himself that he wouldn't die if he hugged the brunette once, so he turned to him and gave him a hug. The man admitted that Hoen's heart was beating fast, and the hearts of the monsters outside the shower doors were no longer beating, so the pounding of the stag's heart gave him comfort. Yenwon, on the other hand, smiled, said he was very glad the guy next to him was alive, and then wished him a Merry Christmas. Hanbin was happy about the decision to pick up Gangwon, plus the guy kept his car keys with him all the time, which was parked in the backyard. Hoen perked up even more as the car was an SUV that could hold 6 people. Plus it had Dabin admitted that she couldn't even remember the last time she had eaten anymore. Hoen was well aware that they wouldn't be able to survive long on shower water alone. At this point, Yusok came out to them and asked them how long they were going to just sit there and do nothing. The man yelled at them and didn't understand if people were going to get together for nothing. Yusok asked how long everyone was going to just sit around and wait to starve to death. But Hoen looked at him and realized they weren't doing this of their own free will. Then he looked at the brunette and asked him how well he was doing. Yusok was angry, as the brunette sat quietly against the wall and listened to music. The brunette looked down at Yusok, telling him that he needed to start by saying everything he had, and if there was nothing to say, he should just leave. That's how they ended up on the street and got to the car. Hoen was going to ride in the front seat. The brunette didn't know, and in truth, he didn't need that information in the future. The point was that they needed something to eat, so Huseok started demanding that Yunwon go and get them food. The young man looked out the window and realized that the situation around was worse than he thought. But on the plus side, the car started to pick up speed. Dabin supported Yusok in going out and getting some food. Hoen speculated that it was a matter of secrecy, as this virus was classified and no one had heard of it in scientific circles until now. Gonu was worried about having to kill those in the hallway, but Yusok felt they had no other choice. The mathematician refused to come out as he didn't want to harm Eugene, even if she became a monster. Gonu's vote aside, Dabin and Yuseok were in favor of going out for food and asked Yunwon and Hoen what they thought about it. The brunette admitted that he would do as Hoen said. Shoten, however, did not understand what was happening to the older man, since the latter, until just a short time ago, had acted like a fool with him, and now tell him to do as he said. After all that mattered to him was that Hoen would be by his side and it didn't matter where. Since that was the case, Dabin asked Hoen what he thought of Yusok's offer. It was situations like this that the guy hated the most, when everyone was looking at him and he needed to make an important decision. He realized that if everything worked out well, he would be on the plus side. If something went wrong, the blame would be placed on his shoulders. So he decided to wait a little longer and see how things would develop. Night came and they went to bed. Hoen couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about why all these strange things had started happening at their university, and then he heard a strange sound that made him sit up. He saw Gonu sitting opposite the front door talking to someone. Yunwon woke up as well, as he heard someone start scratching hard at the door. The mathematician sobbed and apologized to his girlfriend for not standing up for himself and not saving her. So he promised her he would be with her again soon. He opened the door and the girl pounced on him, biting his neck. The boys stood silently watching as the monster ate their acquaintance. Jusok woke up at this point, but he hadn't yet realized what was going on around him. It became obvious that they were in huge trouble because of the antics of Gonu, who was already dead. Eugene didn't come alone, but with another monster, and the two of them ate math. Hoen's mind was a mixture of disgust and fear at the picture he saw. At that moment, Dabin woke up and screamed loudly, attracting the attention of the monsters, so Hoen covered her mouth with his hand and asked her to keep quiet. The girl was badly frightened and trembling with fear. At that moment, Jusok noticed that one of the monsters was walking straight towards them. As it did so, the man moved aside and the monster swooped right at Hoen, but the monster managed to miss and so didn't realize what had happened. Jusok couldn't put two and two together either, so he watched in horror at everything that was happening before his eyes. Unwon, on the other hand, was calm and said that everything was logical. The monsters had come for a nighttime snack. After that, he took the axe and told the brown-haired man to stay close to him, because if he left him for even a minute, he'd be in a state of confusion. Meanwhile, the monster decided to attack him. Hoenn asked his friend to stand up, but he didn't have the strength to do so. Meanwhile, they began to be surrounded. The soldiers had orders to destroy everyone on the spot. Unwon even experienced some kind of satisfaction, as Hoenn didn't want to listen to all this nonsense, so he tried to carry the older man on his back. They left bloody footprints in the snow, but the brown-haired man did not get. However, they didn't have much chance to survive, as they were followed by somehow in some unfathomable way. Hoenn fooled the Voic and was able to take one of them hostage, while asking the others. It turned out that the soldiers were told that there were no living people in the university, and everyone there was infected. Hoenn prayed. Meanwhile, the soldiers reported the situation. Thus, the soldiers brought the boys to the city. Hoenn lay in the hospital, and beside him sat his sister and wept. The girl said that all the relatives of the students were told that everyone at the uni had died, so she was very happy that Hoenn was only allowed to see his sister because he promised to keep his mouth shut, and his every word or action was closely monitored. Now, every day, the guy was tortured with different procedures, as it was necessary to create a vaccine. Evening came, and Hoenn walked out into the hallway. He still felt like he was in that nightmare, for he could not explain to anyone in the world what had happened. So Gonu picked the weakest link, the oldest of them, and bit him. At that moment, the brunette asked the brown-haired man to open the locker that was behind his back. As soon as Hoenn did so, the monster reacted to the sound and ran forward and sealed itself into the locker. And then Hoenn kissed his dear elder. The locker that was behind his. The young man didn't resist and pressed Gona's hand against the locker. Such malleability surprised the brunette, for the lad had not been so docile before. At that moment, they both realized that there would be no more repetition of the nightmare. Plus, the moment Hoenn felt like he was going to be turned inside out, Enwin cut off the monster's head. There was an oppressive silence in the shower room after that. Dabin was the first one who couldn't take it and threw up, while Jusok sat there shaking with fear. Meanwhile, Hoenn was in prostration and didn't react to Unwon's words, who called out to him to go wash up since the monster's blood had gotten on him. Suddenly, the brown-haired man realized that the brunette didn't care at all about the fact that he had killed two subhumans. Although Hoenn never came to his senses, he did take a shower. He used to think that he would be able to adapt to the circumstances, be able to reassure others and survive. But after what happened now, he wasn't so sure anymore. Now he felt how wrong he had been, and it was a dream, not reality. At that moment, Enwin came over to him, turned off the water, and told him that you should shower after you take off your clothes. The brunette tried to unbutton his shirt, but the brown-haired man pushed him away and told him not to touch him. It wasn't the touch itself. It was the fact that the man was doing it with the hands he had just used to kill. Unwon was sad at the thought of the younger man disliking him so much. But that wasn't the point. It was the fact that a man had just died. The brunette was angry. He tried once again to get through to the younger man because it was time for him to realize that there were practically no more people here, and the things that hunted them were not people, but monsters. Hoenn didn't understand how you could kill left and right, how you could use other people as bait to survive. At this moment, Unwon looked at Hoenn and recognized that he had a talent for making people furious. And then he asked the guy to tell him if he pissed him off or not, because that would be honest, and no, that's it. For in fact, the brunette could see perfectly well that Hoenn had been giggling weirdly all day, trying to please everyone instead of saying what he really thought. After all, Hoenn had always just gone with the flow, didn't like to make decisions or take responsibility for his decisions. Besides, the one was constantly trying to pretend that he was all noble, so it was time for him to put the pretense aside. The brunette realized that the younger man wanted to remain a do-gooder until the very end, even if he died, which made him as cruel as possible. Everything Enwin had said before had seemed meaningless to Hoenn, but of this moment, now many things were beginning to make sense. It was only now that Hoenn realized that the older man was right about everything. All his life, the guy really just wanted to live and never tried to take the initiative and would make the decision for him. Even now, he constantly criticized Unwon, but hid behind his back in moments of real danger. And then the brunette touched the guy's waist, pressed himself against him, and leaned into his neck. In addition to touching Hoenn's waist, Unwon also touched another spot on the Shatten man with his foot. So Hoen asked Yunwan to move away from him a little. For in essence, the brown-haired man knew exactly what was going on and couldn't mistake this feeling for anything else. But Yenwan wasn't going to move out for nothing. The brunette was going to stand like this for a while, for he wanted the brown-haired man to comfort him with his body. The brunette's intentions were hard not to understand. So eloquent were they. So he tried to move away and let him go. But Yunwan only hugged the young man tighter, not understanding why he was pushing him away. After all, he had just asked to be comforted by his body. Hoen, on the other hand, offered the brunette a hug like last time, but this time the brunette's cuddling wasn't enough for him, and he asked the guy to do what he had fantasized last time. Suddenly, the guy realized what the conversation was about. He blushed heavily and decided to pretend he didn't understand. But the brunette didn't believe him this time. After that, Yunwan touched Hoen in an obscene manner. The brunette kissed his partner's neck, and he realized that he'd always thought he was crazy, and now he clearly understood it. And then Enwin looked into Hoen's eyes and asked him not to look at him with those eyes, because he was only getting more aroused. The man realized he didn't want to hold back any longer. After that, he pressed Hoen against the wall, and the latter did not understand how someone could feel such sensations in a situation when there were corpses lying in the next room, and the air was soaked with blood. Hoen blushed, breathing heavily, and asked the man to stop and let him go. The brunette pulled back a little, but he asked Hoen to promise him something. Yenwen asked the brown-haired man not to throw around any more words about death and not to die so foolishly. The young man made this promise to the brunette, and he let him go. Yunwen hoped that Hoen would definitely keep his promise. After all, even if Hoen forgets about everything again, he will always remember that promise. Having said that, the brunette went to leave, but at that very moment the brown-haired man asked him to stop. He looked at Unwin and said that he really was wrong about the situation. To tell the truth, the young man didn't fully understand what the man was saying, but the man convinced him nonetheless. Hoen realized what he had done was wrong, as he kept hiding behind the brunette's back, causing trouble and not wanting to take responsibility. However, he didn't understand what the man really wanted from him. After that, Hoen started to get worried as he didn't know what to do next. Most importantly, he said everything he wanted to say. Shaitan was worried. He hoped that by saying all this, he hadn't brought a storm upon himself. Ki Yunwan approached Jong Hoen. He tried to touch his cheek, but the guy recoiled because he was afraid that the brunette would hit him. But it didn't happen, and the brunette stroked his cheek and then said that such words gave him hope in his heart. Hoen showered and thought about how for a very long time he couldn't take his eyes off of Yunwan's kind smile at that moment. In one of the lockers, the guy found some spare clothes and changed. He hoped nothing bad had happened outside, but he was mistaken as he heard Dobbin's voice trying to reach Jusok, who was unresponsive to her voice. The girl turned her head and motioned for Hoen to come closer to them. She realized that there was something wrong with the older one, but what exactly she didn't understand yet. The girl said that their acquaintance had a high fever, lost his breath, and did not regain consciousness. She tried to find out what was hurting him, but he did not answer her. Hoen realized that was rather strange, and then asked where Yunwan was. Dabin said that he had gone to scout. Hoen touched the older man and realized he had a high fever and knew something had to be done about it. But then his eyes opened wide as he realized what was happening to the older man. The man began to turn into a monster, since he had been bitten by Gonu the day before. Dabin got really scared and started hiding behind Hoen's back. At this point, it came to the guy's attention that he and the girl were not allowed to stay in the shower room any longer. Dabin hadn't gotten the gist of the whole situation yet, but Hoen said it was time for them to leave and be sure to find Ki Unwan. Dabin was worried about the fact that there were monsters outside the door, so they weren't allowed to leave, but she didn't realize that she was in even more danger here. The boy didn't know what awaited them beyond the door, but he knew very well that they wouldn't survive here. The girl hesitated, so Hoen took her by the shoulders and asked if she was ready to pick up an axe and chop off Yusoku's head like Yunwan had done earlier. There was no more time to think. Yusok had turned into a monster, so they ran out of the shower room, though they didn't realize where they were running to. Hoen understood perfectly well that it was better to keep their distance. But here the monster was also running very fast, so they definitely wouldn't be able to escape. At that moment, the guy remembered the brunette's words to her in the shower. So the guy decided to summon the monster's aggression on himself and asked Dabin to run the other way and find something to hit the monster on the head with. The girl pretended to understand and ran to find an object to hit. After that, to get the monster's attention, Hoen threw a pack of cigarettes at Yusok's head. To make the monster run after him, Hoenn shouted, drawing attention to himself. It worked, and the monster just ran after him. Hoenn was well aware that if it wasn't for Unwon, it could have been him in Jusok's place and running after people, trying to bite and eat them. Now the lad was well aware that his life was not at all to his credit, but that of another man. It was sad to accept the fact that these all humans were no longer humans, but it was true nonetheless. So the guy stepped aside and the monster, before he could react, fell out of the window. At that moment, Dabin ran up to him, carrying a heavy object in her hands. She was the one who couldn't stand it and hit the monster on the head with a heavy book, wishing it dead. Honestly speaking, Hoenn was greatly shocked as the girl showed strong aggression and kept hitting the monster with the book. But she lacked the strength to kill the monster. At this moment, Hoenn remembered the promise he made to Unwon and made every effort to help the girl. Together, they managed to throw the monster out the window. The guy realized that this was a temporary measure, and Jusok would be back soon since they hadn't cut off his head. At that moment, Enwin came up to them. He praised Hoenn and said that they really should run away from here. Afterward, the brunette hugged the châtain and took his time to tell her where he had been before. The man stood for a long time and hugged the brown-haired man, who didn't realize what was happening to him. The brunette looked at Hoenn and said that if he was going anywhere, he should definitely take him with him. Châtain understood everything perfectly, while Dabin watched their interesting relationship from the sidelines and remained silent. Hoenn, on the other hand, asked for the brunette to let go of him. He didn't understand if it was really that unpleasant. And next, Unwon said something that scared the girl, for she and the brown-haired man were screaming so hard that they could be heard on the other floor, which meant that the monsters would be here soon. But here Hoenn wasn't quite sure what his friend meant. To make the boy understand everything, Yenwon asked him to listen to everything himself. At this moment, Hoenn's face contorted in horror as he heard the roar of all the awakened monsters rushing over. And that meant they were in big trouble, because it had become much harder for them to survive. After a while, they came to another door, stopped and waited. Dabin knew full well that behind that door was the reading room, so she asked the boys if it would be safe or not. Yenwon looked at her and asked if she had any better ideas. She said she didn't. What she knew for sure was that they were not to go to the cafeteria next door under any circumstances, because it was really bad there. The girl perfectly remembered the moment a whole crowd of monsters jumped out of there. Hoenn became frustrated as now they couldn't get food. At that moment, Hoenn looked at Unwon and asked him about the box he was holding. The brunette shifted his gaze to the object he held in his hands, but was in no hurry to answer. He just picked up and dumped boxes of instant noodles on the floor. Dabin and Hoenn each took a packet of ramen. They were happy because they had food now. Hoenn was practically crying with joy, and the brunette realized that this guy was very happy. Hoenn realized that it was so strange to react to ramen like this in such a situation. Hoenn's smile was wide and genuine, for this was his first meal in quite some time. And then he looked at the brunette and thanked him from the bottom of his heart for the gift. But that's where from and how the young man was able to obtain these treasures. But the man was mysteriously silent. At that moment, the door opened and from there emerged a young man, alive, who wanted to eat noodles. After that, they made noodles and started eating. It was hard to believe that you could cry because you ate instant noodles and feel profound happiness about it. There was another group of people in this room who had no hope of survival anymore, as they thought they would die like this in confinement from starvation. One of the girls admitted that the first few days they survived on candy and chocolates they could find on the premises. But there were quite a few of them here. So what food supplies they had were quickly running out, and none of them had a store or cafeteria to walk to. At this time, Unwon was sitting on the sidelines, and Hoenn realized that he wasn't the one who should be receiving thanks. But the man showed no interest in their dialogue, and the girl suddenly asked if they had been hiding in the dormitory all this time. Châtain decided to go along with that assumption, for it was essentially correct. But this group was different. One of them even ran away from the central library. Hoenn didn't expect there weren't any living people left in the central building, but the guy said that wasn't the point. There were real people there, except he couldn't get along with them. The guy said that there was a big fight inside from the group in the central building. Châtain understood that this could happen. After all, different people met and each handled the situation differently. Since the stranger was shaking violently, it was safe to assume that the quarrel there was quite complicated. And the girl decided it was time for them all to introduce themselves to each other. The long-haired girl's name was Cho Sona, and she was Dabin's roommate. Jong Huchin introduced himself and was about to introduce the brunette when he called him over, saying that these people didn't need to know his name. Ki Unwon was sure that everyone in this room was going to die, so the brunette asked the brown-haired man not to waste any more time, but to go to him, as his mood was deteriorating drastically without him. Everyone in the room fell silent, and Hoen tried to convey to everyone that it was a joke, except that it wasn't very believable. Night came and everyone began to get ready for bed. Hoen watched the people and realized that for them, it was all business as usual by now. Except that Hoen and Yunwon were awake and clearly about to do something crazy. The brunette pulled the younger man to him by the arm and said that he had asked him not to move a step away from him. Had the boy forgotten what had happened during the day? Hoen once again admitted he was wrong, but he had no intentions of dying, so the man could take it easy. After that, the guy released his hand and ran to find blankets for them. It was a bit of a struggle, but Hoen managed to find 2 blankets, and they covered themselves with them, while lying down next to each other and trying to sleep. But the brunette was awake and stared intently at the young man. He tried to sleep, but under such a gaze he couldn't. So he asked if there was something stuck to his face. Yunwon admitted that he felt strange since Hoen was different this time, not like usual. This statement seemed very strange to the brown-haired man, for he thought they had met a couple days ago. So he suggested that the man get a good night's sleep, for he was tired today, and the man reached out his hand to hug him. And in just a second, he was already holding the younger one tightly to his chest. The gesture startled the brown-haired man a little, but then it began to dawn on him that Unwon was going to sleep in that position all night. At another time, he would have started to resist, but today he was so very tired that he decided not to pay his attention to such things. A new day came, and it became clear to Hoen that the people who had locked themselves in the reading room were afraid to go out into the corridor. They were even afraid to go to the toilet. Consequently, their food supply soon ran out. The candy was given out piece by piece, suggesting that at this rate they would starve to death sooner than wait for the rescue party. And one day, Hoen heard the members of that group wailing and saying that they could have eaten one more candy bar if Yunwon, Hoen, and Dabin hadn't been here. Shoten was well aware that someone had just accused them of all the deadly sins, and Sona realized that they would have to go out and look for food. Dabin highly doubted they'd be able to find somewhere to eat, but Sona assumed the supplies must still be left in the cafeteria. They were well aware that some of the food was likely missing, but the frosting had to be intact. Dabin doubted it was even realistic to get to the kitchen, since that would require going through the entire cafeteria, which was crawling with monsters. Sona suggested using the freight elevator for this. The girl reported that if you go out the back door and down to the parking lot, there is an elevator that will take them up to the kitchen, and they won't have to go into the cafeteria. Dabin didn't understand why her neighbor had only brought it up now, but the girl and a few members of the group were glad for the information and were about to head out to get food. Sona did not share their enthusiasm. After all, it is not to go to the neighboring toilet. Hoen listened attentively to all this. His sixth sense told the guy that the girl was having a very understandable dialogue. She was saying that it was dangerous to go to the elevator in a crowd and other things in that series. The picture was more than clear, and Hoen had never once in his life suffered a loss because of his guesswork. He noticed everyone in the group staring at him, and he realized that his guesswork was going to come out sideways today. The young man's hunch hit exactly the right target as Jo Sung asked him, and the older man to go grocery shopping alone. History repeated itself, with the girl talking about how she and her group were the first to take the place, and the guys came in already, so they should make an equal contribution to their little community. The girl hypocritically thought her decision was the fairest in the situation. The rest of her group nodded in agreement, agreeing that they were getting short on food with the arrival of the new people. Hoen was seething with anger, as he was well aware that this was utter nonsense and that they didn't have any food as it was, and they were happily eating the ramen that Enwin had brought for him. The brunette agreed that yes, they could starve to death at this rate. Chosona smirked contentedly and considered her devious plan a success. She felt that the boys should help her because of universal justice and nobility, for that way they would help them and themselves. To tell the truth, it was the first time in his life that Hoen was amused to hear something like that, since there was no talk of justice or assistance. Yes, he could and had every right to start figuring out how much and what he and Yunwon had eaten, but he was more offended that Dabin was supporting her roommate and not him. Her entire demeanor demonstrated the fact that she would not help the man who had saved her life several times by becoming part of a new group. Hoen once again decided to remain silent, but Enwin decided to go all the way and said that people should have been more honest. and said that it was better to let the guys die than all of them, because their own skin would be more valuable. The brunette could see through them all perfectly, for they were hungry, but there was no determination to get food, so they decided to eat at the expense of others. Zhongxian decided to keep playing white and fluffy, and said that the point of what she said was completely different. Yunwen was ready to argue further, but was prevented from doing so by Hohen. The brown-haired man said they would leave since they were being chased away. But he also made the point that Sonia should have been more honest, and said she was chasing them away because they were outsiders instead of making up this fairy tale. After all, if she and the others had acted similarly, he wouldn't have been so disgusted after everything she'd said. He then took the older man by the hand and said that they were leaving, as the two of them could handle things together. It looked cool from the outside, but once in the hallway, the brown-haired man collapsed on the stake from the emotions he was experiencing. The guy hadn't expected such behavior from himself, but then he looked at Unwon and asked him why he followed him out of the room without saying a word. The boy did not understand the brunette, for he saw perfectly well that the words of the men did not convince him in the slightest, but he still followed him. It was as simple as 2 times 2 4. Hohen had called him to come with him, so he went after them without a second thought. Understandably, he could have not, but the guy was more important to him than anything else. And then he added, in all seriousness, that he had already said that if Hohen went towards death, he would follow him. If he asked to take his life, he would do it with his own hands. He basically didn't care what Hohen was doing, as long as he was near and in his field of vision. Shaitan once again did not understand what the brunette was saying or implying, and the latter began to chuckle at the absurdity of the situation. Yenwan assumed that the guy thought he was crazy and his words were complete nonsense. The truth was that he was already starting to believe it himself. Afterward, they went outside and Hohen looked up at the sky and saw the first snow for the first time in a long time. Initially, Hohen thought the brunette was strange, a bit out of the world, but the more he got to know him, the more questions he had, so he suddenly asked him what he would do if they managed to survive and leave this place. For some reason, Hohen wanted to know as much as he could about this man, what he would do if their world wasn't full of zombies, but the brunette didn't know what he wanted. No, of course there were things Unwon wanted to do, but he didn't understand why Hohen was asking him about it, and the man said he was just curious. It was the most unexpected question and situation possible for the brunette, as he thought Hohen genuinely hated him, and then he flattened his black armband and smiled roguishly, saying that the brown man had almost led him on. Hohen's heart, on the other hand, skipped a few beats and then galloped under the effect of Kienwen's smile. Slowly but surely they reached the parking lot. But the Shaitan caught himself thinking, catching up with the brunette, that he did not feel any dislike for him, but rather even on the contrary. They reached the elevator, stepped into it, and began to ascend to the required floor in proud and awkward silence. Hohen was the first to decide to break the silence. He realized they were unarmed now, so it was an open question what they should do if the monsters made it to the kitchen. The brunette was as calm as ever. He realized that if the monsters were already in the kitchen, they would have to fight them. If they didn't, they would either lose or die. But more than anything else, the brunette wanted to survive, because this time it was different, and Hohen got his hands on him and was even the first to ask what he would like to do. So it would be maximally frustrating to die in such a situation when things worked out better than usual. The brunette then looked at Hohen again and brooded over what he would most like to do. They arrived at the right floor. The elevator doors opened, and Hohen asked Yunwan not to voice what the brunette was thinking as he looked at him. Since they had arrived, there was no point in standing still either. Of course, they weren't doing it for justice, but rather because they needed to survive. The guys reached the kitchen. There was indeed a small stock of food in the refrigerator, which should be enough for a while. Yes, having food was good news. The bad news was that the cafeteria was full of monsters, and there were only a couple meters separating them. Nevertheless, Hohen began packing food into a large box, and Unwon didn't understand why the Shanette had decided to save the people who had so cynically kicked them out from starvation. Though all those characters weren't to the guy's liking either, but he didn't understand how anyone could be left in the lurch. Shaitan wanted as many people as possible to be able to survive, so after loading the box with food, he gave it to the brunette to carry it to the elevator. Even though such a train of thought was incomprehensible to Unwon, he realized that his junior couldn't do it any other way, and he decided to collect one more box before catching up with the brunette. This time, Hoenn overdid it and the box was too heavy so he could hardly move it. Suddenly, one of the bags that was in the box fell with a clatter to the floor. At this point, Hoenn realized that he had attracted the attention of the monsters, and Sparta was about to begin for him. Just then, Yunwan came into the kitchen behind him, who had lost it and didn't understand why the guy had turned as pale as chalk. But to realize what really happened, it was enough to look behind Hohennu's back, and there was already a crowd of monsters. Here it was no longer about boxes and food, because you had to either kill all the zombies or try to escape from them. For the first time in days, Hoenn decided to choose first. So he fumbled for some object, grabbed it, and hit the monster in the head with all his might. From the force of the blow, he fell to the floor, but he was still alive. Yunwan took the scoop from Hoenn's hands as he didn't understand what he was going to do with it. But the guy replied that he took the first thing that came to hand to hit the zombie. For the first time noticing the guy's determination to survive, the brunette gave him a knife and told him that if the monsters approached him, he should aim at the lower part of his chin. Then those things would definitely die. The elder understood that doing such a thing to a living person was extremely difficult, including morally. But they were dead people in front of them, so there was no need to feel sorry for them. After a brief briefing, the brunette sent the younger boy away from the kitchen. Just reaching the elevator, Hoenn turned around and saw no one behind him. He only now realized that the brunette had decided to take the full brunt of the monster's attack. But saving himself alone while the brunette could die was not something Hoenn could do. So he returned to the kitchen and noticed that the young man was pouring something around the room. Yunwan, on the other hand, called all of his strange manipulations the most common monster hunt. Shetton tried to get the message across that it wasn't time to play games as the monsters were getting closer. At that very moment, one of the zombies slipped on the liquid that Enwin had spilled and fell. But he reached out his hands to Hoenn, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't stand it and plunged his knife into its neck, thus tearing off its head. In this strange moment, Yunwan was proud of his junior. And then he took the head of this zombie and ripped it off, as it was exactly what he was missing for the hunt. Then he took that head and threw it at the monsters. And the next thing you know, in the blink of an eye, the gas on the stove turned on and flames of fire erupted and consumed the monsters. Staying in the kitchen was getting more dangerous by the minute. Hoenn opened the door and started to tell the older man that it was time for them to leave. But he stood still. Nevertheless, they managed to leave the kitchen and were already in the elevator. But the doors didn't want to open yet and the elevator wasn't moving. The elevator, however, did not yield to the entreaties of the young man, who desperately pressed the buttons. Meanwhile, 2 more monsters appeared from the kitchen, which did not burn in the fire. One of the monsters had already reached the elevator, which still didn't want to move in any way. But at the last moment, the guys got lucky, and the elevator doors closed, and the elevator started its movement in a given direction. Sitting on the floor of the elevator car, Hoenn suddenly asked Yunwan since when did the sculpture department start teaching the discipline of ripping off a zombie's head? This question was not answered by Hoenn. Nevertheless, they made their way out of the parking lot and carried the boxes to the rest of the group. It was cold. The wind had picked up and was tangling their hair. The snow was also getting bigger by the minute, and the guys walked in silence so as not to attract the attention of the monsters. Hoenn nevertheless noticed that Sona was already waiting for them at the entrance of the room with 2 guys as guards. The girl praised them for a great job, pretending to care that they weren't hurt. Haven had never thought of himself as a fool, so he immediately realized that there was a catch again and asked the girl and her friends what made them come out here. The boy mercilessly recalled her words to her about them not leaving the library under any circumstances. Sona didn't stop acting like a noble girl and said that she and the company were abrupt, because they also need to be understood. Everyone is on edge. She made up the story again about them guarding the entrance until the guys came back to help them with the monsters, if anything. The guards were drooling over the boxes of food, and one of them even started to ask Hoenn to give him a box, because it was probably hard for him to carry it. But the brown-haired man suddenly froze, staring in front of him. Yunwan didn't understand either. After all, they were the ones who had gotten provisions for the whole group, and the girl was bragging about going out to stand at the door. Sona, on the other hand, argued that this was certainly no accomplishment, and now they would make forays for provisions on a first-come, first-served basis. She even decided to do the guys a big favor and take them off the list, since they had already gone to get food for everyone. Yunwan couldn't listen to any more of this nonsense, and said that it was right that the group felt guilty in front of them, since every member was so cowardly and hypocritical that it was disgusting, since all they could do was wait for someone to bring them food. He approached Sonia and said he doubted that there was anything to distinguish her and the others from the corpses running around in the street. After that, Enwin went to get the rest of the food, and Hoenn realized that he had made a mess, and he would have to deal with the consequences again. Chosona, on the other hand, stared intently at the straight back of the brunette on the other side of the glass doors, and then she ordered her minions to lock the door so no one could get in or out. Hoenn didn't understand how they could make such a move while his eldest was outside. Sona said that only Hoenn could enter the room since he's an acquaintance of her roommate, so she'd believe him. But the brunette isn't one of the people she trusts. Sona was sure that as long as Hoenn was around Kai Enwen, no company of survivors would be willing to accept him. The girl gave advice to the Shaitan. He should come to his senses and stop communicating with such an insolent man, because it is neither him nor brunette to goodwill not bring. Hoenn was confused and realized that maybe being with Unwan wasn't the best choice of his life. But nevertheless, Hoenn chose the brunette's company, for which Sona and the others kicked him out of the building into the street, saying that they had given him a chance, but he hadn't taken it. Shaitan was angry. He was ramming on the door and shouting, saying that Sona and her minions were behaving worse than zombies and had completely forgotten about humanity because of the food. His screams caused Sona to grab the chain and just shut the front doors tight. Hoenn decided that when he died and became a zombie, this would be the first place he would come and eat this particular company. At that moment, Enwin came up to Hoenn from behind, put his arm around him, and reminded him that he had asked him 100 times not to throw around words about death. It was strange to see the smile on the brunette's lips when they were in such a stalemate, and the man said he was happy about Hoenn dragging him through by the hand, as it was very nice. Yenwan wasn't joking. He was quite serious about getting excited about it during the fight, which was highly inappropriate at that moment. The older man steered the brown-haired man away from the building, saying that he had just recently forgotten to turn off the gas in the kitchen. Ho-chin did not immediately get the meaning of the brunette's words, and when he did, his eyes looked like 2 tea saucers, and Yenwan continued to smile his warmest, most enchanting and eloquent smile, addressed only to Hoenn. The brown-haired man's guesses and assumptions were all true, and he realized it because his friend was silent and staring at him. A moment later, there was a huge explosion that blew up the entire building and took with it the lives of Sona and company, as well as part of the monsters that lived in the university. Hoenn looked at all this with wide-open eyes and didn't know whether to be happy or sad. The students who had locked the door from the inside and kept the protagonist out suddenly heard a strange sound. It turned out that zombies had come downstairs and were rapidly closing in on them, so they tried to untie the chain to open the doors. The problem was that they couldn't untangle the chain, and the monsters were already close by. Hoenn froze in the street and watched with all eyes. What was more surprising was that the scene with the locked door, the kitchen fire, and the students who can't open the door was very familiar to him. Had he really seen it in the movies? The monsters had gotten to their victims and were biting and chewing them with gusto, and those couldn't resist them. The brown-haired man suddenly thought that this was all far from reality. Hoenn watched as people died and he couldn't do anything about it, thinking that he would rather be bitten than them. At that moment, Enwin came up to him, noticing his friend standing like a stump, and then he put his hand over his eyes and asked him not to look at it. Shaitan looked at his eldest and suddenly realized that he had always seemed like a perfectly normal part of this whole nightmare. He alone was explainable and 100% real. So the two of them managed to make it to the new building, where they hid, waiting out the influx of zombies. Hoenn worried a lot about his acquaintances, but the older man didn't care. He understood perfectly well that those were dead, unless of course one of them was very unlucky. Suddenly, the brown-haired man concluded that his Unwan looked as if he knew in advance that this was how it was going to happen, so he wasn't surprised by anything, and was calm. The brunette didn't want to reveal all his cards and said it was just a simple premonition, as bad people don't live long. The younger boy didn't stop. He also didn't understand his friend's words that he was bound to survive even if everyone else died. Yenwan wasn't going to answer that question either, and he was fed up with the situation in general. Hoenn's nerves were frayed. He needed answers, so he clutched at his friend's arm, trying to stop him and get what he wanted. The boy realized that the older man was right in saying that he was stupid and had absolutely no idea what was going on, which was why he was asking him to tell him everything. Besides, he didn't hate Yunwon. Rather, it was already the other way around that the elder disliked him. After all, that's exactly what his friend's eyes were telling him. Kozin cried, for he realized that he was close to losing his mind, for he did not understand Yenwon's ciphers. And the latter was constantly angry with him. Shaitan also apologized for causing half the food to have to be given away, and the other half they lost on the way. At this point, Yunwon gave his friend an apple and said that he wasn't funny now. But he was funny in the canteen when he waved his ladle in front of the monsters. The brunette picked this apple especially for the younger boy on the way out, knowing he would love it. Besides, he knew very well that Hoenn loved apples very much and would never give them up. Junior did his best too and hid some candy bars in his pockets, which he now wanted to share with his buddy. He had hidden them on a hunch, since those people didn't look very trustworthy, and now he was glad of it, because he could treat a friend. Except there was one problem. Hoenn didn't tell his eldest that he liked apples. Shaitan didn't recall talking about his taste preferences, so it was an open question as to how his friend knew about his passion for apples. Yenwon didn't answer, so Hoenn only had to thank him for his attention. Now he had the courage to also thank the elder for having saved his life countless times already, because otherwise he would have died long ago. Hoenn sat down to eat an apple, and as if casually said that he had no dislike for the brunette, but rather the opposite. The guy admitted that before, when they first met, he was annoyed by his friend's sarcasm, but now he realizes that every word in it was true. Now they both needed to eat well and gain strength, for only then would they be able to go out. Hoenn believed that if they both gained strength and overcame everything, they could make it to the end and survive in this terrible world. For a moment, Yunwon was immersed in his memories of watching his friend die an infinite number of times, so not reacting to his words scared him. The young man came out of his stupor and began repeating the name of the brown-haired man, hugging him, snuggling up to him. But when Hoenn repeated that he had no dislike for the older man, he couldn't stand it any longer and kissed him. Yunwon broke away from his occupation only to say that the guy in his hands was very handsome. They were hiding in a library-like room, and Hoenn was burning up and getting sick. He'd been sitting alone in that room for quite a while since the brunette had gone exploring, and his condition had gotten quite bad. So he went out into the hallway to get a drink of water from the cooler, but it was no longer there. At this point, the guy thought that if they had stayed in the dormitory, there would be no need to think about water. At the moment when he wanted to go back and quietly wait for the elder, the guy heard the voices of the survivors. He was about to look at their hideout when he was suddenly stopped by Unwon. And next thing you know, the guy witnessed a gruesome scene as one group of bat-wielding survivors swooped down and mauled another as he took some of their food. Moreover, the student with the bat started beating up the instructor, believing that it was not his concern what he would eat. This was the central library, where there should have been a lot of people by idea. But when the main characters got here and started looking around, they couldn't find anyone. Now that Hoenn had seen one man killed by another man, he realized why monsters weren't the most terrifying thing in this building. Once they were in a relatively safe place, Yenwon plowed the younger boy down and began berating him for going out alone and walking around obscurely, as if looking for death. Shaitan got up and said he was out because his throat was very dry and he wanted a drink. After all, he had caught a cold and now everything was blurry in front of his eyes. Yenwon scooped up the stag in his arms to carry him to a place where he could lie down for a bit. As always, Hoenn started to kick, embarrassed and asked to let him go. But of course, nobody was going to do that, because the brunette was angry that his friend had found adventures on his ass again. The older man laid him down on the couch. He didn't understand why he was wandering the halls in such a state. Then Enwin touched his friend's forehead with a cold hand, which gave him real relief for a few seconds. Outside, he was also lucky enough to find a can of soda, which he was going to give to the sick man. Only it wasn't that simple. Yenwon forced his friend to ask himself to get him drunk. Though Hoenn asked, but here the brunette only sighed and ruffled his hair. He looked at his friend and realized he was pretty damn cute in that moment. And in the next instant, they had already begun kissing passionately. Yenwon, on the other hand, wanted to combine the pleasant with the useful. So he filled his mouth with soda and gathered mouthfuls of soda through his mouth to drink his friend. The older man broke off the kiss after a moment and looked at the guy beneath him, realizing that even without his strength, he looked cute and seductive. The younger man was even a little offended that he was called cute all the time, because the young man could at least call him handsome once or twice. Suddenly Unwon said that the brown-haired man even in death looked cute. This made the guy sit up, because it sounded like the brunette had already seen him die. Again, images of the past flashed before the older man's eyes, so he listened to the heartbeat of his youngest. They sat like that for a while, and Hoen fell asleep on the couch, while Yunwen sat on the floor and watched him sleep. The older man admitted that he had been trying to find a cure all day, but had never been able to do so. Still, it was a library, and the weather was still, which meant the students must have brought something with them. He was going to go and look again. Hoen stopped his friend. He didn't want him to leave, as the cold could go away on its own. He just needed to be patient for a while. Except that the brown-haired man looked so bad that he seemed like he was going to die any minute. Hoen, on the other hand, was very worried about his friend, because knowing his character, it wasn't hard to guess that he would get into a fight with those guys, which would attract the attention of the zombies. For that reason, the brown-haired man didn't want to let the older man go. Hoen couldn't help his anxiety for his friend, as he worried that something might have happened to him. As usual, Junior said a lot of other things that made Unwon very angry, because he concluded that he wanted him to survive, but he didn't care about his own life. But he had a different opinion on the matter, for even if the world dies, Hoen must live. Hoen was left alone in the room. He to and fro slept and woke up thinking about the brunette's last words. However, he still couldn't understand why his friend was persistently trying to save him. Hoen sat down on the couch. His head was dizzy and sore. His body felt like lead, so he realized he wasn't yet an assistant to the older man who had gone over the water. At that moment, he heard a woman's voice outside the door. The girl was obviously running away from someone, so the guy decided to take a couple steps to the door. The protagonist realized that the girl was in trouble and was being chased by yesterday's guys with bats. The stranger knocked and asked to be let in, at least for a little while, because otherwise she would simply be killed. Hoen couldn't leave things as they were, so without a second thought, he opened the door in front of the girl. Hoen saved her, but then passed out and woke up in the brunette's lap, and the stranger told her that there had recently been a skirmish between survivors here, so she had escaped. And if it hadn't been for the guys, she would have been killed too. Yenwon was silent and listened to the story. The girl also said that she just wanted to get her stuff, and they took her and called her a thief. From the look on the older man's face, Hoen realized he was angry, though he only asked about sleep and his well-being. Shaitan was thrown into a shudder and started apologizing for everything in the world. Except it was all wrong. Unwon was sad that his friend didn't understand anything again, and was apologizing just for the sake of apologizing without understanding the reason for others' concern. So he didn't need such apologies. At this point, a girl intervened in their conversation and asked if she could continue her story. The stranger's name was Kim Na-hee, and she thanked Hoen from the bottom of her heart for her help. She emptied her backpack of her belongings in gratitude. There was some medicine in there. Of course, it wasn't cold medicine, but better that than nothing. So she gave it to her savior. After that, she decided to leave, as her companion was probably already waiting. She didn't know about what was going on outside the library walls, as her phone had broken, but she was trying to find out. But so far to no avail. Hoen was surprised to learn that when the whole nightmare started, they started a radio broadcast and asked no one to leave their rooms. It was also said that traffic and movement will be restricted for a while, but if everyone follows the rules, everything will be fine. It was also reported that there was some kind of accident in the lab building. The girl left, and Unwon and Hoen were left alone, the brown-haired man sleeping sweetly again, and the brunette guarding his sleep. The older man was getting more and more worried about his friend, as his fever was not going down, even though he was applying a cold towel and cooling his cheeks. This was the first time a situation like this had happened to them, so the brunette had no idea what to do or how to do it. It felt like he was in some world of his own right now, so all talk and talk about their story ending before the guy started to get sick. Hoen came to his senses, and the older man wondered why he was always looking for trouble in one place. In addition to being worried, the older one was also very jealous, as the younger one took the medicine from the girl with a smile, and it is worth it to bring him something, as he has a stony face. On the second 24 hours, it came to Hoen's attention that Enwin had taken offense at him. And since he's highly offended and not in control of his anger, something needs to be done about it and fixed somehow. The older man thought he wasn't mad, since he simply couldn't be mad at Hoen, but he was offended that his favorite friend was being nice to anyone. Yenwon definitely knew how much he wanted Hoen to make it up to him, and to do that, he needed to take off his hoodie. The younger boy thought it was about an article of clothing since Nahaya had given it to him, but the brunette thought his friend was a little strange. All of the younger boy's words and actions seemed very sweet to the brunette, and he was afraid that if this continued, he would really misunderstand his friend. Hoenn didn't understand what he was being accused of, because there was basically only one strange person here, and it wasn't him. Junior agreed, and Unwan began to molest him again in a very blatant manner. True, this time he pulled away abruptly and asked what Hoenn was thinking at this interesting moment. The answer was as original as ever. The brown-haired man kept thinking about the fact that his friend had very large hands. Unwan liked the answer and continued his pestering. But this time Hoenn interrupted him and asked what the brunette was thinking. The older man, on the other hand, was thinking about how seductive his favorite friend looked under his clothes. Yenwen monitored his partner's reactions and realized that the latter liked everything, while Hoenn himself realized that he needed to push the brunette away, since they had only recently met, and there was all this. The older one reminded the younger one to be a goody-goody and not yell if he didn't want a mob of zombies visiting. The young man paid no attention to Hoenn's feeble protests, and continuing to speak vulgarities, continued his molestations. For a moment, Hoenn's embarrassment changed to surprise and fear, and then to expectation of the banquet to continue. They finished their exercises quite quickly, and Unwan noticed that his partner couldn't come to his senses. They decided to postpone the second round for later, and Hoenn went back to sleep, as the sickness wasn't going anywhere yet. Though the younger boy wanted to sleep a little longer, Yenwen asked him to wake up and get up, even though he realized he was still under the impression of their closeness. Nevertheless, it was necessary to get up, as they had a guest coming to visit, and Hoenn needed to get dressed quickly if he didn't want to show his hickied body to the girl. Nahaya came to them. She was trembling and crying. Hoenn couldn't understand anything from the girl's story, so he looked out into the hallway and saw a sea of blood everywhere and corpses at the bottom of the stairs. The protagonist realized that these corpses were different from those he had seen before, and the girl said that her friend had gone to look for water at night and did not return and found her in such a state. Though the brown-haired man didn't want to believe or admit it, it was most likely not the work of monsters, but someone else. At this moment, Enwin came to them and said that when a person became a monster, their blood would start to rot and become viscous, and there was too much of it here. The man knew that even if the monster's head was chopped off, there wouldn't be so much blood, and also the color of the liquid would be different, not so red. The girl fell to her knees as the meaning of the guy's words came to her. Hoenn, too, was only now realizing that it was a show of force. The girl's corpse left in the passageway to show that anyone would die who invaded this territory without permission. Nahia turned back to Ohyun, and the girl tried to comfort her friend at least a little. Panic reigned in the group of girls, with Jinhek wailing that they were all going to die, and Hoenn realizing that they may have overreacted by joining them. It turned out that the most dangerous group of survivors occupied the 5th floor and took all the supplies. Initially, they all gathered supplies together, but then the thugs took away the others' medicine, water, food, and didn't even want to share candy, so they started killing other survivors. Hoenn didn't expect anyone to behave like that, and the girls said those guys wanted to make their fortress out of that building. At this point, Jinhek suggested going up to the 5th floor and killing everyone there and taking away all their supplies. Hoenn hadn't expected such bloodthirstiness from the guy next to him. He understood the need for supplies, but not in the same brutal way of getting them by killing other people. The protagonist was trying to get the message across that it's wrong to do this, that it's not easy to take a life and even harder to live with it going forward, except that Jinhek came up to him and asked him to stop with the tedium and righteousness. Yenwen listened to the wretched man say that his Hoenn's views and torment his conscience in this new world are wrong and cannot be criticized in any way. The student felt that Hoenn's morals and pure thoughts were superfluous and would not help anyone. He believed they were all in a situation close to martial law and a counter-terrorist operation. Shaitan suddenly realized that with such words, the guy in front of him was justifying his desire to hurt others and get away with it. The girls pressed themselves against each other and listened as Jinhek said that the weak are always bullied. If you don't want that, then you have to become strong, or be originally born a strong man. Nahie couldn't stand it and asked the guy if he thought they were hurt because they deserved something like this. The boy insincerely apologized. He hadn't expected it to sound like that. After which he yelled at the girl because she didn't understand what he meant by preparing equipment for farming. And he still didn't realize that it wasn't a game, but reality. Yenwon couldn't and didn't want to listen to this nonsense about the game world anymore. So he walked over and punched the student in the face. After that, he gave a couple more blows, saying that he was so stupid that nothing useful could be heard from him. He should have kept his mouth shut and not pissed off the older man, but he didn't, so he got hurt again. Unwon was angry, and very much so. He was curious if his opponent would play such a lame game. He ended up bringing Jinhek to tears and turning his face into one solid bruise. Yenwon warned the student one last time that he had better listen to his Hoen, as he was saying the right things. And it was even better if he sat in silence and even breathed through the time. Haon and Hohen began to discuss a plan of how to proceed. The problem was that their opponents never went on duty one at a time. They always went in groups. If those guys made up armed groups of 8, 9 people, their group was 5, of which only Unwon could fight properly. Hoen didn't write himself down as a strong man either. He realized that it didn't matter the time of day. They wouldn't have an advantage over the enemy anyway. Since that was the case, Enwin made the decision for him, saying they would go and do it at dawn today. Then he asked everyone to go to the top in 4 hours, because in any case the end is predetermined. Their little group armed themselves with everything they could and moved out to the point 4 hours later. While the others took a crowbar each, Jin Hyuk, as the most delinquent, was given an ordinary broom. And then Hoen brought back his own words that if it's a computer game, the best equipment is more properly given to the stronger players. And this is clearly not a guy. It was time to start their operation. The first one to go into the enemy's lair was Haon, since they at least already knew her. The girl decided to try and negotiate first, and if that didn't work, she'd give everyone else a sign. The girl went upstairs and Unwon picked up his axe and sat down to wait for the signal. Hoen watched his friend carefully and noticed that he was completely calm. So he asked permission to ask him one question. Na-hye was thoroughly embarrassed when she heard the brunette offer the brown-haired man a deal, a kiss for every answer. It seemed to Hoen that his friend spoke as if he already knew ahead of time what was going to happen and when. However, the older man went on to say that there was no hidden meaning in his words, but the brown-haired man began to highly doubt it. At that moment, Han came back to the guys. She informed them that something strange was going on, and there was not a single living soul in the library. Since that was the case, everyone figured it was their chance to get the supplies without any wounded or dead. But Yenwon said they still had to wait a bit longer. He ordered everyone to stay where they were and sit quietly for now, while not asking him anything. No one understood why they couldn't go there if there were no people upstairs. But the elder wasn't going to explain his words. Jinhek thought he was immortal and began to ask the brunette reproachfully how long they should sit here and wait for the weather for some unknown reason. The guy considered the main characters cowards and decided to go to the library himself and take all the supplies for himself and not share with the others. Haon also decided to take a chance and go to the library again, instead of sitting here with the guys and waiting. The girl saw the cookies, chocolates, and first aid kit there, and thought that if she went now, the chances of getting everything were high. So she didn't listen to Hoen, who tried to stop her. But then she changed her mind and decided to believe these two one last time and sat down next to Unwon. The girls sat down to wait, and Hoen was glad that he didn't have to look for reasons why it was necessary to do just that. Since there was no more room on the steps, Enwin pulled his dear friend towards him to sit on his lap. It made the girls a little uncomfortable, since the main characters had been behaving this way from the beginning. At that moment, they heard a commotion and how a crowd of people chased after Jinhek, and Unwon said that was the reason why he asked everyone to wait a bit. But this was not the end, and the elder asked Hoen to be patient a little longer, for it was not yet time to make a fuss. Shaitan, however, caught himself again thinking that his friend knew all events ahead of time, which was why he was acting so relaxed. Suddenly, the boys were thrown into a shiver as the electricity in the building abruptly disappeared. From the shouting on the 5th floor, it was clear to Hoen that this was a very real trap to catch those who would try to take the supplies. Now it was obvious that people who were willing to kill other people for supplies wouldn't leave a warm place for nothing. Realizing this, Hoen asked Unwon to run far away from here with him, but the brunette reassured him and asked him to stay by his side all the time and not to move away, because then together they could survive. When everyone started looking for Jinhek, Unwon took Hoen's hand and said that now it was time for them to join in and go up. The brunette asked the girls to hide somewhere and not to follow them and wait for their return, because they should be okay. The older man hoped the brown-haired man would have no trouble getting up the stairs in the dark, and asked him to be careful not to cry if he ran into something. Hoen didn't understand where his senior got the energy for jokes. especially when their acquaintance had been caught completely feral by the students. At that moment, the brunette led his friend to the doorway and asked him to memorize everything he would see. And there, just then, a group of men were beating Jinhek, intending to kill him. But not only that, Junior had memorized the location of the medicine and food, so he slowly made his way to the target. He realized that he had to do everything carefully, because if he was caught, he would turn into a corpse. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't be quiet, and he was noticed. So the guy took a flashlight from the table and hit his opponent in the face with it. After that, he rushed like the flash to the exit, even though he realized he was spotted. Except that Hoenn came with Yenwon, who decided to axe anyone who wanted to hurt his Hoenn. However, there were more bad guys than good guys in the library, and one of them attacked Hoenn and started choking him. This time, he was saved by Nahie, who punched the bad guy in the causal area, so much so that he was skewered. Meanwhile, Haon had gotten a lot of miscellaneous stuff and was ready to get out of here. They had all done well with the task at hand, so Unwon now asked his friend to run as hard as he could from here. Shaitan obeyed and ran away from the library with the girls. They had been running for quite some time, and Hoenn suggested to the girls that they leave this building as soon as possible. When Hoenn suddenly twisted her leg and fell down, her friend immediately came to her and asked her if she could get up and walk on. Hoenn suddenly realized that his new acquaintance was in no condition to run, so he made the decision to distract the bad guys so the girls could escape from here. He asked them to do as he said, because he hoped that he and Unwon would have the strength to get out of this mess alive and meet the girls again. Except nothing came of that piano, as the bad guys were already here. It was obvious that the protagonists were surrounded by their enemies, and they hardly had any way to dodge the fight. But this time, Hoenn was not going to stand still and asked his friend for an axe. Their opponent only chuckled as he knew it wouldn't help him. Except that the protagonist did not throw an axe at people. He just took it and broke the glass, thus luring monsters here. At this point, all the zombies that were in the building started running over here at the noise, scaring the bad guys. Now all the students began to run past Hoenn, everyone except the bandit leader, so the villain took and hurt the protagonist's leg pretty deeply. He thought he'd won, thought it was so easy, and it would have been if Hoenn hadn't had Yenwon with him, who went wild and hit the ringleader over the head with an axe for injuring his youngest. All the other students who had been brave up to that point were now trying to get their feet away from the brunette who had gone off the brakes. He didn't plan on letting go of any guy who hurt his favorite friend one way or another, and grabbed one of them by the neck. The brunette, on the other hand, asked them nicely not to touch or harm his youngest, because if he died, it would start all over again. At the last moment, the brown-haired man managed to hug the older man from behind and asked him to stop and not kill people. Yenwon heard that Hoenn was fine, and more importantly, he wanted to live, so he asked his friend to come to his senses and leave the zombie feast. The older man came to his senses and asked his Hoenn to be patient for a while, for they had a short stretch of road to run. The pain grew worse with each step, but ahead of them the girls met them and called out to them. Thus, the four of them had managed to escape both the bandits and the monsters, and now they were taking a breather in the hall. The girls gave Hoenn some food and water, for they could not resist going after the boys. So on the way, they picked up a little of everything from what they had lost. But it wasn't just the girls. Unwon had picked up various things, so he began to dump supplies out of the pockets of his clothes. At that, he looked expectantly at the brown-haired man and smiled, as if he was waiting for praise from him like a cute puppy. The girls had been talking amongst themselves up to this point, and decided to go to the part of the uni where the hobby clubs were, figuring they could find the essentials there. The guys didn't answer anything to that, but continued to watch the rather dangerous situation outside the window. Hoenn sat down. He even felt a little sad that it was just the two of them again. He also apologized to the older man for hurting himself pretty badly for acting like a fool. Shaitan thought he was weak, and there was little or no help from him, yet he asked his friend to take him along, for he would try his best. Yenwon saw no other option for himself, for if Hoenn had asked him to stay here, he would have nailed him on the spot. After that, he pulled down the guy's pants and asked him to sit still. As he had to treat the wound, the brown-haired man really didn't expect it to be so deep and dangerous. The older man had found an antiseptic, so he asked his friend to close his eyes and grit his teeth, for he was about to wash the wound. The Shaitan wasn't just in pain. It hurt terribly as soon as the liquid touched his open wound. So to keep from screaming at the whole building, he squeezed his temporary doctor friend to the point of pain. In the second step, Yenwon began dressing the wound, and Hoenn was running out of energy to endure this torture. Junior flushed and began to shed bitter tears. The brunette couldn't get enough of his youngest and then gently began wiping away his tears. At that moment, for Unwon, there was no one more beautiful in the world than his Hoenn. Saying that the kid was much cuter alive, Unwon kissed him gently. One kiss was clearly not enough for Unwon, so he wanted to continue. But Hoenn asked him to stop as someone might see them. But the brunette didn't think so and continued his active actions, asking his partner if he really disliked his actions that much. I should have said they didn't like them, but Hoenn didn't, so the older man did as he saw fit. But after the first round, suddenly Hoenn admitted that he was very embarrassed to look at his partner. He felt very embarrassed about the fact that he had never helped the brunette in any way and had always just gotten everything. But the brown-haired man was a little mistaken, for he was the one, according to Unwon, who constantly saved him with his unreasonable kindness, even hating him. But the problem was that Hoenn had never felt a sense of hatred toward his partner since the day they first met. It wasn't a lie, and the younger man asked Unwon if he was willing to follow his suggestion. Suddenly, Hoenn thought about the fact that his friend was constantly getting his hands dirty in blood, killing monsters for him. But if it wasn't for this whole nightmarish situation, he would have been an ordinary student. He would go to classes, sleep in at night, socialize with friends, and think about what to eat for lunch. So now, more than anything else in the world, Hoenn longed to see just such a brunette. And to achieve this goal, the Shaitan suggested to the older man to get to the main gate together at all costs, because it was foolish to wait for help, so they had to save themselves. And even if he forgot what he had just said, let those all words remain in Unwon's memory. But it didn't make sense that only Unwon would remember all of this. So Hoenn asked him to survive and escape from here together. The elder agreed, and thus they had one big goal for the two of them, after which they hugged each other tightly. Afterward, they reached one office with no luck, but whether it was safe there, that was the question. But Yenwon didn't know the answer and decided to test it out in practice. This surprised Hoenn, for this was the first time something like this had happened. They were lucky as no one was in the room, and obviously no one had gone in there before them. It was curious where everyone had gone. But then their attention was drawn to the work computer. Hoenn thought it wouldn't be unreasonable to try to learn at least something about the current situation at the university. They read the correspondence from the corporate chat room and learned that some sort of accident had occurred in the virology lab. This information coincided with the information about the radio broadcast that Nahye mentioned earlier. Suddenly, they opened the doors and saw a small kitchenette with fast food items. There really was a whole mountain of ramen and bottles of drinking water. Hoenn even found something that looked like instant soup. So he asked his dear friend to wait a bit, and he would quickly cook them something normal. Unwon didn't understand what was going on after all. His birthday had long passed, since his Hoenn had started acting so nice to him. Shaitan didn't argue with that, but he wondered when the older man's birthday actually was. The brunette didn't understand where the attraction of unprecedented generosity for interest came from, to which Hoenn replied that the older man had always been interested in him, not just today. It wasn't forbidden. So Unwon replied that his birthday was December 24th. Hoenn suddenly wondered what his friend's birthday plans were, who he wanted to spend it with, and how he wanted to spend it. But the guy replied that he didn't remember anything about it. The older man crossed his arms over his chest and said he'd forgotten about his winter vacation plans too. This seemed strange to the younger boy, for Unwon remembered perfectly well that he liked apples and had taken to forgetting about such things. Yenwon could see in his eyes that his junior had something to say, so he asked him to do it directly. The brunette leaned too close to the Shanette again, asking what he was trying to find out if he was really that bored. But since this was in the brunette's opinion an interview, Hoenn asked him directly about whether or not they had met before. Unwon didn't want to answer that question, so he changed the subject, asking if this was a new way of seduction. And if that was the case, then it had completely ruined his mood. But the brown-haired man had no such thoughts. Unwon gave up and asked his partner to name a specific period of their acquaintance. Hoenn wanted to know about the period before all those terrible events at the university. But he didn't expect the brunette's answer, because he said they had never crossed paths before that. That was the end of their conversation, and Hoenn decided to freshen up a bit, as there was water in the taps here, and clean towels too. The water was soberingly cold, but good thing it was. Unwon wasn't in his office as he went to inspect the floors upstairs. The protagonist noticed that as soon as they moved into this building, Unwon became more nervous and tense, and it was quite strange. The guy was also sad that all his attempts to talk to his friend were like peas against the wall, as he only repeated that he didn't know anything. Since that conversation in the kitchen, the brown man had a strange feeling from his friend's words, because he said that before the events with the monsters, they had never met. So how to explain it to himself, he did not understand. There was also a sneaking suspicion that Unwon was checking something when he asked for the period of their acquaintance. Someone was at the door and Hohen opened it, thinking the older man had returned. But there stood a hungry and angry monster. The brown-haired man now realized that he had made a mistake, sinking so much into his thoughts that he had been careless, and now the zombie was attacking him. The zombie was clearly stronger than the man, but he still managed to bite or scratch him. He realized he had no right to waste time or hesitate, so he reached for his knife, which he drove into the monster's throat. Hohen remembered all the brunette's instructions on killing the undead and do as the man told him. At that moment, Yunwon entered the office and froze in the doorway, observing this interesting picture, after which he swiftly started to approach Hohen, who asked him about. It was exactly the same with him. He felt the same way when he killed the first monster. Yenwon was very much afraid for his friend, but nevertheless he spoke rather sharply, indicating that he had made the whole mess in order to understand his feelings. 4. Next, the older one snapped and started choking the younger one, saying that if he wanted to die so badly, he should have asked him to. The brunette admitted that the first time he killed a zombie, he was both scared and heartbroken. The older one let go of his youngest, who really did almost die of shortness of breath, and said he didn't need to be comforted, but the younger one should be. He then ordered Hohen to take off all of his clothes, as he would now comfort him in a mature manner. This time they didn't stop at the usual caresses, but went much further. Toward the end, Yunwon made a very interesting confession. Yes, even though they had not met in civilian life, but nevertheless he knew his partner very well, and that had to be accepted. Time passed and the older man was about to go exploring. However, he asked his partner not to open the door or go out into the hallway for anyone else. Since one zombie had already managed to get here, it was necessary to kill all the others, in which case Hohen also wanted to go instead of sitting here. Menos thought he was getting strange feelings because of his long association with Primo, and he also warned her that she would have a lot of work to do when she returned, and the girl said only that she would try very hard. But Yunwon thought that was a very bad idea, since he had been here a couple times himself and didn't really know what was what, so it was better for his friend to stay in the study. Yunwon definitely didn't want them to die together, but what he didn't realize was that he and Junior had become quite similar. What Hohen meant was that he'd been in that enclosure a couple times himself, so he didn't know what or where it was either, meaning they were in the same position. The only thing the Shaitan knew with certainty was that there had to be a 300-person ceremonial hall upstairs, and it was just about graduation time, so there were most likely a lot of people there. But that didn't impress Unwon, and he sent the younger boy to sleep, as he wasn't going to change his mind. And it seemed like Hohen even agreed. But the thing was, he didn't like sitting in one place and doing nothing. And since Unwon didn't want to take him upstairs with him, he decided to go down to the basement and see what was going on down there. Plus, maybe some food could be found there. This caused another flash of anger from the brunette, as he had already bluntly said that the guy couldn't help him in any way. So it was best for him to sit in one place and not cause trouble. As it was, Hohen wasn't going to do anything, so he looked around at the boxes that were around. But every time something like this happened, a man in a black cloak would appear out of nowhere and save her life. After all, until this moment, Yunwon had always been calm, even when people around him were being sent to the other world in rows, and he hadn't received a single injury in the battles with monsters. She was also beginning to realize that one day there might come a day when the townspeople who loved her now would point their guns at her. And yes, she was insanely afraid of all of that. It would be foolish to deny that Yunwon scared him quite a bit. But at the same time, as they slept in their dreams, constantly asking him not to leave or die, it was only when she got to his seat, took his place, that the girl felt the full force of the weight of the loneliness of the throne room on her skin. At that moment, she remembered the words of the stranger who had saved her life the first time. He had asked her to try hard, but Alex doubted that someone like her was worthy of those words. He had a terrible headache attack, realizing that Hohen was acting this way because he didn't know anything. Then, as the pain receded a little, he saw in the window Hohen, who wasn't supposed to be there. Junior decided to go down to the basement and see what was there, because he was alerted by his friend's words. Right now, it was important for Hoen to understand what Unwon was hiding from him, why he was trying to restrict so much, why he had become so irritable, and what it was that he had seen in this basement. Yenwon opened his eyes and saw Hoen lying next to him, curious as to how he had slept all this time. The young man reached and immediately hugged Hoen, asking him not to die, not to look at anything, and not to remember anything. Shaitan was shaking. He didn't understand why the older man had kept the truth from him, why he hadn't told him anything, even though he knew exactly what was going on here. Unwon covered the guy's eyes with his hand and asked him not to look again, and Hoen didn't understand. He really didn't understand why Hyung didn't warn him beforehand if he already knew everything. This time, the older man was acting even stranger than usual. He almost fell on the stake, begging, pleading with the brown-haired man to forget everything he had just seen, not to let this little thing break him, for they must survive. Hoen was well aware that what he saw before him were the corpses of people who had been untouched by the virus, all of whom had committed suicide. Hoen realized that on the first day of this nightmare, such a decision would have seemed like a great option to him as well. But not now. Yes, he was scared, and that was an undeniable fact, and he might even have followed the other's example if he had seen it for himself. But he was with Unwon, and asked him why his words so often sounded like he was dead or about to die. The younger boy was hurt, as he realized that Unwon had not trusted him for a single moment from the first moment they met until now, and had absolutely no faith in him. Hoen cried as he now had to admit the unbelievable truth that he had all along closed his eyes to, as it was uncomfortable and unbelievable, so he pounced and asked the brunette if he had really seen him die. As hard as it was to run away, no one was going anywhere, so Unwon said that yes, he had seen Hoen's death and lost count somewhere around the 20th time. Hoen hugged the older man. He could see clearly now that he had become the biggest test for this man who knew him best, who had protected him, never let him down, and was always at his side. Before all these terrible events, Unwon, like many other boys his age, went to classes, listened poorly to the teacher at lectures, and scribbled something in his notebook. To tell the truth, he almost fell asleep. But maybe he did, because there was no one else in the classroom except for the teacher, who had not yet left. The young man understood that most likely now he would have to listen to the man's tedious lectures on behavior again. But he couldn't help it, because the lectures were very boring. At that moment, he looked out the window and saw Hoen in the company of inveterate smokers lurking around the corner. Shaitan listened with a fake smile to his friend's gossip about some older man they called very strange. Yenwon didn't deny that he didn't understand this guy, who now sent his friends into the woods for mushrooms, but in fact smiled sweetly at them, saying he was a kind-hearted man. The brunette knew well this type of person, who is always nice and friendly with everyone, always smiling and can support any conversation. But when the guy was alone, he pulled out a pack of cigarettes and smoked. Meanwhile, the teacher was talking about the term dead man's switch. Unwon stared at the smoking Hoen for quite some time, when suddenly a classmate approached him and reminded him that he had promised to come to their party at the end of the semester. Although Unwon didn't particularly want to come, but this time he would have to, since the party also coincided with his birthday, and his friends wouldn't forgive him if there was no celebration. Next day came, and Yenwon had to show up at the appointed place at the appointed time and accept birthday greetings. At that moment, a friend noticed two beautiful girls at a neighboring table and suggested that the birthday boy get acquainted with them. The brunette wasn't going to do it, but he couldn't forbid his friend. But he said that Unwon should be the one to bring the beauties here, since they only fall for his pretty face. Nevertheless, the brunette did not want to meet the girls and was going to go out, although his friend tried to bring him back. But the guy did not plan to continue the evening, but gave the credit card to his friends to get them off his back. The club was stuffy, so as soon as Unwon stepped into the light of day, he felt as if he had been reborn. At this moment, he remembered the expression on Hoen's face as he smoked alone. It could be compared to a savory pastime. And vulgar thoughts and questions about this strange guy's behavior with girls in bed are already popping into my head. Unwon returned to his dorm room and immediately fell asleep from exhaustion on his bed. The young man himself was well aware that such thoughts were strange to say the least, so he figured that if he got a good night's sleep, everything would be back to normal in the morning. Only under the morning something went wrong. He woke up from the fact that the neighbor just returned from a party in the room and cowered not letting the main character sleep normally, except that the protagonist heard some rather strange sounds, so he couldn't sleep anymore and sat on the bed, looking towards his neighbor. He didn't answer any questions, but just sat in the corner and growled, which made him think that he had had too much to drink and still couldn't think straight. It couldn't go on like this forever, so he approached his friend and started actively offering different options to help, like buying a hangover tonic to go. But as soon as the neighbor looked at the brunette, he twisted with fear and tried to recoil. Thus, the classmate lost his balance and fell to the floor. And Unwon got angry and started to ask what had gotten into him and what these strange behaviors were. Unwon looked at his friend and realized that it was hardly a prank, for he had always had a bad sense of humor, and he had never really understood jokes. The guy kept cowering and growling, and when he raised his head and stood up, it was no longer his friend, but something else entirely with red eyes, growling at the whole room. And then it started reaching out its hands to the protagonist, trying to scratch and bite him. The brunette tried to run away and hide in the bathroom to begin with, but the monster that was still recently his friend was quite strong. So sitting in the room wasn't an option, and with little luck, he dashed out into the hallway and ran, shouting and asking if anyone was alive. Reaching one of the neighboring rooms, jerked the doorknob. The guy opened it and saw a girl in a pool of blood. It seemed all unrealistic, some nightmare. So he continued to run forward. He was already being chased by his former friend, who had become a monster, and he kept calling for help because a man had died here. Obviously, this was all real and therefore not a dream. Then maybe someone here on campus decided to film a reality show but didn't warn anyone about it. At that moment, one of the doors opened and someone grabbed his arm and pulled him towards them. It was Hoen who pulled him into his room and started quietly asking him about what was going on outside on campus. At the time, Yunwon didn't yet know the name of the Châtain, but he recognized him as the same guy who was around the corner smoking a cigarette alone, and now he was offering to call the police. They didn't know what to do as a monster started breaking in the door. It growled and tried to break the door down. The protagonists piled on the door with all their might, realizing that they had to keep the zombies from breaking it down or they would be finished. The monster backed off, and the guys exhaled a bit as they could catch their breath. Hoen suddenly thought there was a fight going on in the hallway, as all these people were too strong. It was stupid to just sit there. So the brown-haired man introduced himself first, and waited for the older student to tell him his name too. Yenwon introduced himself, but he still didn't understand why the junior was asking that if he didn't care at all. Hoen smiled, and Yunwon thought that strange guy in front of him, smiling, standing there, and even in such a stalemate. Maybe someone else wouldn't pay much attention to the little things, but the problem was that the older one was scrambling to see the younger one, who was looking for something on his phone. Shaitan, on the other hand, had already reached the police and said he was calling from a university dormitory, except that no one on that wire would even listen to him all the way through, telling the guy to hang up and it was all an evil joke and they were dealing with serious stuff. The police hung up. Hoen wanted to call back once more, since they really were in trouble, but the network was overloaded and the calls just weren't getting anywhere. Meanwhile, someone's door opened and he was already being attacked by a mob of monsters, while the guys stood looking at theirs and listening to the screams outside the door. At this point, the older man realized that it was dangerous to be here, so he offered to leave for good. Hoen asked to tell him what was going on there, but Yunwon wasn't going to do that, as he realized that no one would believe him. So he offered to see everything with his own eyes. That time was the first time they and the other survivors had managed to get to the shower room, and they were now sitting there. The girl with the glasses kept checking the student forum, and there were constantly updated pictures from the scene, and they didn't look fake. It didn't look much like mass murder either, because there was no maniac who gnawed his victims with his teeth, so no one could come up with a normal explanation for what was happening. Hoen thought back to the picture he'd seen on the way here, and realized that what he'd seen bore little resemblance to a simple murder. There was already starting to be a disagreement within their small group, as one of the students started yelling at the girl and blaming her for the fact that the police still hadn't arrived, but she, like everyone else, didn't know why no one was rushing to save them. Meanwhile, Hoen noticed a huge gash on one member of their group's leg and thought he had hit something while running here. So the brown-haired man suggested that everyone pay attention to the guy with the leg wound, since he had been looking painful for some time now. His intuition didn't fail him, and their new acquaintance turned into a monster and attacked one of them, sinking his teeth right into his neck. While everyone stood in shock and didn't know what to do, Unwon picked up a heavy chair and was clearly going to use it as a weapon. Yeah, the monster got hit in the head. But now they needed to get out of here. But before they did, they barricaded the door. So this whole township thing wasn't so easy to figure out. Yenwen, on the other hand, was left one-on-one with the monster. But although he was cheering with all his might, he still couldn't knock out his opponent. The brunette asked Hoenn to help him drag his classmate into another room and lock him there. And until the other came to his senses, run as far away from here as possible. So the protagonist and the girl left the shower room and fled to an unknown place, not even knowing if it was safe or not. But it was just as dangerous to run down as it was to be here, because there were also many wounded and dead. So we had to check the safety of that place first. The security check was to be handled by one of them, so as not to go there in a crowd and attract unnecessary attention. Since it was a girl who had suggested the idea, she should be the one to check it out, according to the logic of one of the guys in their group. Unwan didn't share these views but kept quiet. But the guy was getting more and more aggravated and said that if they continued to stand here, they too would become zombies. Hoenn intervened in the dispute. As always, he wanted to smooth the edges, so he asked them to stop arguing because he would go to the test alone. The brunette realized that it was dangerous to walk even in groups now, let alone alone, but Hoenn took out his axe and was about to go. But before leaving, the boy handed the axe to his new friend, realizing that of them all, the one was the strongest, and if he felt threatened, he would have to go to the brown man's room and sit there. Yenwen was convinced that the worries about this strange guy with the cigarette were not his to worry about, and that it was up to him to worry about his life. The persuasion and deal with his conscience continued, the brunette talking himself into leaving the guy alone as he had every right to do whatever he wanted with his life. It had been quite some time since Hoenn had left, but no word from him had been heard, which was pushing certain thoughts. It was hardest for the girl to contain and hide her emotions. She went back and forth asking the guys why Hoenn still hadn't returned. It was logical to assume that something had happened to the guy, and he was just scared and hiding somewhere, but that was a best-case scenario. It was also obvious that sitting on one's ass in this place was not an option either, and one had to do something and go somewhere. At this point, Hoenn connected to the radio station and addressed his new acquaintances. The first thing he said was that he was in the service area. Yenwen didn't understand why he was doing all this. Was it really to mess with them? But Hoenn spoke again and asked them not to go downstairs under any circumstances. The brunette's heart skipped a few beats, while the members of their little group talked about how good of an idea they'd been to send just the brown-haired man on a scouting mission. Except that Unwan didn't share their joy. So he decided to go to his new friend's aid, even though it was dangerous and he could die there. The older man was annoyed at the guy's eloquence, which had come on abruptly like that, because up to that point he had almost fainted and said nothing when the guy with the cigarette went downstairs. He didn't understand why Unwan was saying something to him, because he was just like him, except that the brunette didn't deny it, but recognized it completely. However, he no longer wanted to be in this place and breathe the same air as this guy and girl. He ran down the stairs and realized that he shouldn't have cared about this whole situation. But for some reason he did. Besides, something inside, perhaps a sixth sense, told him that it was the youngest of them all who least deserved to die. There was chaos and horror going on the first floor. Monsters were walking everywhere and looking for people. Yunwan table around the corner and couldn't get out yet, thinking that it all looked like a low-budget horror movie. At that moment, one of the zombies found him around the corner and was about to attack him, but Unwan put his axe into his side. Only this technique did not help him in any way to kill the monster. It was still moving and attacking the young man who was desperately fighting back. And then, by naivete or game experience, Yunwan plunged his axe straight into the monster's neck, and blood splattered in all directions. Even though he had killed the monster and even bought himself some time to find Hoenn, he felt disgusting afterward and even threw up. The elder couldn't stop repeating to himself that he simply had no other choice. For if he wouldn't kill the monster, then the monster would kill him. Up ahead was the commandant's room, which meant that that was where Hoenn was sitting right now, which meant that he was probably broadcasting from there. Yenwen ran over to the window of the room and started pounding on it with his fists to get the attention of Hoenn, who was sitting there proudly alone. The brunette didn't understand why the door was locked and why he had to break it down to enter the room where Hoenn sat sad next to a computer. The youngest sat silently and did not touch anyone, did not react to anything, which greatly agitated the older one, who tried to shout to him. He even assumed that the guy fainted from fear. Unwan came closer to see what was so important written on the stickers, that his friend was looking at them so intently, but he said it was nothing important. He just liked apples very much, and his grandmother had an apple orchard in the village. Hohen told me that his grandmother, every time he came to visit her, selected the ripest and prettiest apples for him, and this vacation he was just about to go to visit her. Yenwen dropped the axe and turned the guy's chair around to face him, trying to see his face and figure out what was happening to him. He saw the wound on the guy's arm and the blood that was dripping on the floor, and heard his voice asking why he had come when he had asked them not to come. Hohen had no more strength left. He had been crying for too long, in pain for too long, worrying about others for too long, so he was starting to pass out. After some light breaking, the guy came to his senses and admitted that, truth be told, he thought no one would come to him. Tears poured down his pale cheeks. He admitted that although he had told no one to come, and indeed no one came, then he was afraid, because more than anything else in the world he did not want to die alone. Hohen was in too much pain and fear and didn't want to die, and Yunwen signed his weakness as he had no idea how to save his friend. The older man realized that the guy in front of him was dying now, slowly and inevitably, until a couple of hours ago they had been talking. But now he was a pale version of himself. But the problem wasn't even that the guy was dying. It was that he had turned into a zombie. So Yunwan picked up his axe to chop off his dear Hohen's head so he wouldn't be tormented in his new body anymore. His heart clenched in his chest as the elder didn't realize if he could find the strength and force himself to kill an innocent man who had been bitten by monsters so that he wouldn't become like the ones. Except that a moment later something happened that he could not have expected in any way. The brunette woke up again at the same time, in his room, in his bed. It was logical to assume that everything that had happened before had been a dream, but it was unlikely that dreams could be that realistic. So he stared at his hands in horror. Suddenly, he realized it wasn't a dream as his buddy was turning into a zombie again before his eyes. So he grabbed a paper knife from the table. It was definitely not a dream, and his friend became a monster again and attacked him again. But this time he was expecting it, so he cut off his head with a knife. If everything was happening again, then Jong Huchen too had to be alive and still in his room. The only thing the lad understood very well was that he must get to the little one's room, must make sure he was all right, and then sit down and talk to him. The young man ran to Hohen's room and began to bang on the door, for he remembered perfectly well all the events that had happened to them recently. Moreover, he remembered the password to the guy's door, so he entered it in an attempt to open the door. And a miracle happened. It opened. At that very moment, Yunwan saw Hohen sleeping sweetly, calm and completely alive. He stood there covered in blood and just stared at him. The eldest began to wake his youngest diligently to open his pretty eyes, for he had a serious conversation with him. Hohen started to open his eyes, but he didn't expect to see a guy covered in blood, who said he had died yesterday and didn't understand how he had managed to stay alive. But the youngest was only now frightened, as he didn't understand who had broken into his room and what he was demanding from him. Yenwen grabbed his arm and started asking him if he didn't remember how there was a bite mark in that very spot, and the blood was gushing out like a fountain. The older man kept saying strange things and he looked like a maniac. So Hohen pushed him away with his foot and once again asked him who he really was. Moreover, Shanton took a knife from the table and with shaking hands pointed it at the brunette, repeating his question, who the guy was and how he got here. The problem was that Hohen remembered absolutely nothing. Only Unwen remembered everything, who now didn't understand what he should do or how to go on living. The older man was already beginning to think that he had lost his mind completely, that he was seeing all sorts of nonsense that normal people don't see. Still, Yunwan needed answers, which he had to give to Hohen, who was scared shitless and asked the brunette to stay away from him. The older man also felt a wave of despair. He didn't understand what was going on here, and why he was the only one who remembered everything, while Hohen pretended not to understand what was going on. Schotten, as always, tried to get into his state. I'm a kind guy, so I tried to calm my opponent down and ask the one he did to him. At that moment, a girl knocked on their door, screaming and begging to be rescued. This was Yunwan's sign to act, so he pulled Hohen behind him, as it was time for them to get out of here if they didn't want to become zombie fodder. The older one ran forward, pulling his little one behind him, only this time they were blocked by two monsters. Enwen covered his dear friend with himself. He realized that they were making too much noise, so the monsters started to converge on their screams. Now it was too late. One of the zombies had just attacked Hohen, and he backed up out of fear and started to fall downward out of the window, The older man tried to grab his arm, but he failed and the guy fell to the ground and died of injuries incompatible with life. After that, the brunette woke up in his room again, and out of worry, he even fell off the bed and tangled himself in the blanket, and then threw up. The roommate was turning into a zombie again, and the guy realized that he had only seen this kind of thing in movies, and now this kind of thing was happening to him. He had to kill his roommate again. The only thing that was clear was that every time he died, he returned to this moment in his bedroom, and most importantly, only he remembered it. This time he decided to change tactics a little and did not go to Hoenn, and ran up instead of down, because it was especially unsafe down there. The young man decided that he no longer cares about the Shaitan, and each of them is now for himself. So he will only save his life, because the one constantly added to his unnecessary problems. He came to the shower room. There was already a group of students gathered there. The guy hoped to the last that the code from the door would not fit, but it did. The older man realized that the most important thing was to hold out until the police arrived, and then he could breathe easy. But this time, the situation in the shower room was even worse than the last time. One upperclassman was forcing the others to live by his rules and go downstairs to get groceries, with him not wanting to do it himself, but forcing others to do it. The kid asked the older man not to send Eugene down to the store today, as she was feeling very ill today and couldn't go. The elder was still trying to say something, but at that moment, Unwon fell on top of him and couldn't move. At that very moment, it began to dawn on Unwon that something had happened to Hoenn and he was dying again, and the brunette was dying along with him. After that, the young man found himself back in his bed, in his room again with the same zombie neighbor. For the first time ever, a rather strange premonition visited Unwon, and he decided to check it out immediately, though on the other hand, it was more of an instinct. So he's standing at Hoenn's door again, asking him to open it and save his sinful life, and so the puckish man opens the door and asks what the guy's got going on. It was exactly as he had suspected. It was Jong Hoenn who had been the trigger for this nightmarish curse. But there was only one question. How could this all be possible? Come to think of it, every time the death of the youngest had opened up all the events on Christmas morning, and it had all happened over and over again, and the brunette was the only one who remembered it. But why was Hoenn the trigger? Because before all these events, they didn't even know each other, so why him? The situation was a stalemate, because it was obvious that he had to protect this guy by any means necessary if he didn't want to go through this all over again. But time after time, no matter how hard the older man tried, he failed to save Hoenn's life, and he died again, bringing everyone back to the past. One day, Unwon just couldn't bear to watch his dear Hoenn die in his arms again, so he jumped out of a building window with him. The most frustrating and scary thing was that he was the only one who remembered everything down to the smallest detail. It was unbearably painful. They had bonded especially hard that time, and it had been a wonderful feeling in part. But Unwon knew full well that in a few moments, Hoenn would forget him again. Truth be told, Unwon would give anything right now, so that for one single time after going back in time, Hoenn would still remember him, even though he realized there was little hope of that. Everything happened again. The older man was already getting a bad headache from the memories, but he was curious if his roommate was tired of turning into a zombie in their room time after time. But this time, instead of running straight to Hoenn after killing his zombie neighbor, Unwon decided to take a shower and wash off all the blood. It did feel good to stand under the jets of water, but somehow there were no more feelings left. He wondered what he should do after this, and realized he would have to go and check on the youngest. He would again play the role of the student he was seeing for the first time, and they would again pretend to talk to each other for the first time. But here was the strange thing. The moment they had last died together, Hoenn was smiling. This time, the guy's end was pathetic and he was smiling. But it wasn't just Hoenn who was weird. Unwon himself was no less weird, as remembering that moment made him horny. Surprisingly, it was the older one who could see the different emotions on the protagonist's face. It was the fake smile of a do-gooder, and condescension, and misgiving, and fear. He also saw the guy screaming excitedly. He himself was driven to frenzy by the lad's moans of pain, and by the mole under his eye, which was drowning under a flood of torrential tears. For the first time, Unwon was crying, wishing that someone would come along to tell him that it wasn't real, because this horror couldn't be real. Yenwon moved forward, cutting his way forward with the zombie axe, because he was still trying to convince himself that it wasn't real. He was hurt and scared too. The guy realized he was tired and fell to his knees. He convinced himself that this was a quest, that this was a game, that Hohen didn't exist in this game reality either. But the brown-haired man was, as always, he found common ground with everyone, was the center of attention, and the brunette decided he would treat it as a mission to save the protagonist from death. The young man also decided that he needed to gather more information, and then maybe he could find a way out of this situation. But it was an open question how many more times this would all have to be repeated to find the answer. And again, time after time, to go through the familiarity with Hohen, who doesn't remember him and looks at him as a stranger. During one of these encounters, Yunwan lost control of himself and attacked the younger boy with fists, because he wanted him to stop behaving like that and pretending that he didn't know him, even though he realized that the boy really didn't remember him. The brunette lost control of his emotions and started to choke Hohen, as he couldn't listen to his greetings anymore, after which it was clear that the guy didn't remember him. Other students thought Yunwan had lost his mind and tried to pull him away from the brown-haired man, who didn't understand what had caused his new acquaintance to be so aggressive. After a while, the guy was tied up and locked in a back room. They wanted to use him as bait for monsters. Suddenly, the students asked Hosen what he thought about it, since he was the one who was almost killed by the brunette. There was a suggestion from him to kick Yunwan out so the others could run to another building while the guy was stalling. At that moment, the brunette realized that he was most likely going to die once again. The moment Yunwan made the decision to kill all of his fellow students when he started his life over, Hohen changed his mind and said that he was against doing such a horrible thing to his captive. Shaitan was sure of what he was saying, for it was the brunette who had saved their lives many times, and they had only gotten this far because of him. Besides, throwing out or killing everyone whose opinion differed from the majority was wrong, because then people would turn into monsters themselves. You can't trust others if you know that person is ready to betray you at any minute. However, none of the students were going to support Hohen's idea, for they were afraid of the brunette's strength and directness, and did not want to go any further with him. Since the matter was at hand, Hohen decided to stay here with Yenwen, as he couldn't continue the journey with such miserable people. Thus, the boys found themselves alone against the world, locked and beaten in a back room. Shaitan made the decision to untie the brunette, but also asked him to keep his hands loose and not try to strangle him anymore. Yenwen tried to figure out what kind of person his friend was, but the only thing that came to mind was that he was nothing but trouble. When they left the storeroom, they started running down the stairs. It was a short walk to the exit, but there were too many monsters gathered there. At that moment, Yunwen was skewered as he realized that he had made a mistake, and they would not get out of here alive. The brunette was sure that they had no chance of surviving, so it was a waste for them to leave the storeroom. Besides, it might have been better if he had killed Hohen earlier. Yunwan didn't have the strength to live in this nightmare anymore. He was ready to end it all once and for all. He just didn't know how. Shaitan tried to cheer him up, telling him that he was definitely not going to die today. Hohen had come up with some sort of plan for himself. He was going to give the brunette a signal for the guy to run downstairs. The guy thought his friend had a better chance of survival than he did. Yunwan realized that the brown-haired man was taking the role of bait since he was injured, and believed that Yunwan should be the one to survive and bring the police here to help the others. The older man didn't understand why Hohen was doing and saying all this, but then he saw his crying face. Junior wanted to believe that the brunette could save himself, and then he would surely come and save him. He also asked his friend for a rather cruel thing. Even if he loses his memory and can't remember him, Yunwan should definitely keep the memories of the two of them. It was obviously not a dream, nor a game, for Hohen's skin was warm, and his heartbeat echoed in his ears, and hot blood flowed through his veins. Yenwan, on the other hand, could not let his friend die, so he asked him to give up the failed scheme. The brunette knew that there were too many monsters in that side, so the guy wouldn't even be able to move a finger as he would immediately die. This is the scenario they lived through for about the 8th or 11th time, and that then and now they have no chance of survival. The brunette didn't ask the brown-haired man to give up the failed idea, but he wasn't going to back down, because until they tried all the options, they wouldn't know how things would work out. Hohen ran downstairs, and Yunwen was reaching for his hands and begging him to come back, as he realized that there was a cycle waiting for him to go through from the beginning. For perhaps the first time ever, Yunwen was crying now. He was begging his friend not to die, even though he knew it didn't make sense. He saw a knife sticking out of one monster's back and reached for it with a trembling hand. He didn't have the strength to bear all this heartache anymore, so he decided to try to end it all on his own. Only that plan, like so many others, had failed. And now he was back in his room and was already looking at a dead zombie roommate. No more feelings at that, so he calmly went to take a shower after the kill. I changed clothes and went down the hallway to get an axe to kill zombies as I went. So, he went up the stairs and tried to remember what he wanted to do. At first, he wasn't good at it, but then he remembered that he had to take care of Jung Ho-hyun. He had to wait upstairs for his friend for quite a while, but the latter this time came running into his arms himself. The brunette's actions were frightening as he stood up and was about to throw the axe. He was angry at Hoen for putting his hands down, but also asked him not to forget him and try to survive at all costs. The axe flew past Hoen's head and hit right in the bullseye, namely the head of the monster that was chasing the guy. After that, the older man walked over to the brown-haired man. He was glad he hadn't died on the way here. As usual, Hoen remembered nothing and asked questions that pissed off the brunette because he remembered everything perfectly. As usual, Hoen didn't understand what was going on, and Yunwon was getting angry as he had to be told the same thing over and over again. Yenwon, who had killed the zombie a minute earlier, looked intimidating. So the brown-haired man remained silent and didn't know what else he could say. The brunette didn't give his youngest a chance to escape and then asked him, pinning him against the wall, if he really thought he was going to kill him. Unwon was on edge, but he didn't want to kill his friend, because if he did, he would have to start this whole nightmare all over again. At this point, Hoen decided to pretend that he recognized the guy in front of him and apologized to him for not recognizing him earlier. He tried to feed Unwon that because of the stress he'd been through, he was confused, so it was hard for him to remember people and events from the past. Of course, the brunette didn't believe the tale, but he wasn't going to leave Hoen alone either, so he ordered him to follow him and keep up. Hoen didn't understand why they were going to leave this place. After all, they had everything here, namely water, food, and a bed. At that moment, Unwon realized that he had just died recently, and this was the beginning of a nightmare cycle. The guy replied rather rudely to the brown-haired man that there was no point in being in that hole, unless the guy wanted to call the monsters to the party by making free entry, since there was already no door. Hoen ran after Yunwon and asked him to wait for him, for he was wrong to suggest such nonsense. Yenwon no longer remembered how many times he had died, and the owl had come back to life, and Hoen was only beginning to realize what was happening, saying what he had done was wrong. Present tense, the brown-haired man realized he was no saint, had done bad things, and couldn't remember everything right now. But besides, it was entirely possible that he had messed up somewhere too, which was why it was happening to them. For all of this, the young man apologized to the brunette. Yunwon was sure that no matter how many times things started from the beginning, there was no way Hoen could love him, so he didn't want to give in to false hope right now. But at some point, the brunette began to feel like things had gotten off track, as Hoen thought he was the one who hated him, not the other way around. The younger man lay almost senseless, but the brunette's cold hand brought him relief. Hoen had no idea how much Unwon longed for him to recognize him, to say hello first, to trust him, to show him sympathy, to smile only at him, to call him fondly by his first name. They sat on the basement floor for quite some time and hugged each other tightly. Now, for the first time ever, Unwon didn't want to die, since Junior didn't hate him. The brunette didn't want to lose his friend. On the contrary, he dreamed of meeting the usual Hoen, like that day in the pears, watching him laughing and talking with his friends. They were experiencing a very intimate moment. Suddenly, Hoen remembered their mutual promise not to die under any circumstances, but to survive together at all costs. Hoen then went into the room with the corpses of people and ripped a poster off the wall, saying that this time they would definitely survive, so they wouldn't have to relive the nightmare again. Such a determined and courageous Hoen Yenwon did not remember, and the brown-haired man said that now it was time for his friend to make him a promise, namely not to give up or fall into despair. After all, if they make a good plan, think things through, and follow that plan, they will definitely survive and leave this place. For the first time, Yunwon decided to trust Hoen and believe that they could break this vicious cycle, because up until this point he had seen the guy as a punishment from heaven, but now it was different. So, they returned to their mini base in the library and began to scrutinize the diagram of the university on the poster. Hoen looked carefully at the places they had already been to, the point where they were now, and assumed they should go to the gym next. The brunette thought it was a disgusting idea, as his youngest had been killed there once before with extreme brutality, so he didn't want to relive it a second time. Noticing the fact that Hohen was clutching his stomach, the brunette decided to get a little spritz to it, and offered to either massage his tummy or blow on it to make it stop hurting. Both men were in serious contemplation. Only one was trying to make a survival plan, and the other wanted to sweetly torture his youngest. Shaitan felt that now was not the time for such things, so he needed to study the map that Yunwan was eager to tear into small pieces, because the younger boy was not paying any attention to him at all. But the older man had other plans for his friend, so he kissed him passionately for starters, and his naughty hands went further down. Doing various lewd things to Hohen, the older man demanded that the boy decide where they would go next, to which building of their university, and asked him to do it quickly. Meanwhile, Yunwan's actions became more active and more shameless, and Hohen assumed that his partner had taken offense at him for some reason, but the latter neither denied nor confirmed it. To get his partner to stop, Hohen promised him never to ignore him again, and never to pay attention to the map again. Turns out Yunwan could be cute and embarrassed too, because now when he asked his partner to name his one and only, he looked just like that, and Hohen didn't hesitate to honor his request. This made a lasting impression on Yunwan, and he began to pamper in a very unorthodox way his friend, who was still not used to this kind of pressure, and often asked to slow down. But it wasn't in the hands of both of them to retreat or play innocent, so for a moment the brown-haired man even thought that he was about to go crazy with sensations. But at the same time, he was afraid of becoming like a rabbit, for whom time and place didn't matter. It wasn't long before Hohen began to realize that he liked absolutely everything they did alone with Unwan. The guys didn't spend much time on special exercises, but they did. So Unwan took out some candy bars from his backpack to at least eat a little and regain their strength. Meanwhile, Hohen had put on his jacket, for it had gotten colder the last few days. But that was not their biggest problem. Yenwan didn't believe they were going to the main gate, but the brown-haired man confirmed the information. It was also impossible to delay the escape, because the food and strength reserves were not as large as in the beginning. So now the guys were looking out the window and thinking how they could pass unnoticed by the crowd of zombies on the street. Suddenly, Hohen found his car keys in his jacket pocket, which meant they could go down to the parking lot and try to look for a car in order to get past the monsters. The plan was quite even working, so they quietly reached the parking lot, found a car, but at this point their luck ran out, because the battery in the car did not work. Hopes of the guys to leave this ill-fated university with a breeze by car failed. Suddenly, Hohen asked his friend how many times he had been in this place, but he sharply replied that he did not remember. Last time the situation was worse than now, as after they saw the mass grave in the basement, they ran across the field to another building and died, as they didn't have enough strength to break through the zombies. At that moment, another idea came into Hohen's head. He decided to use a bicycle to get around, although it seemed unrealistic, as there was snow and ice all around. For some reason, Yunwan thought that Hohen was trying to make them die again, because they wouldn't be able to survive playing in the snow. At that moment, a zombie tried to attack them, with its head pierced by Unwan with his rock backpack. He believed that all the monsters would follow them. It was only worth it to get on the bike and start moving. At this point, Hohen realized that his friend was very much worried about him, so the right thing to do would be to try to calm him down and give assurances that he would not seek death. The young man was well aware that up to this point they had only used their physical strength, so they were very tired, but the bikes were their only chance to beat the monsters in speed. Yenwan was not satisfied with this explanation. After all, he had already seen Hohen die so many times. Besides, the guy had risked his life dozens of times and tried to save him. At this point, the brown-haired man concluded that even in those times, he did not feel hatred for the brunette. After such a heartfelt speech, the older one decided to relent and went straight to the bikes, calling the younger one with him. So, Hohen was to pedal. The guy was grateful to his friend for listening to his suggestion and decided to try this way of moving, and everything would have been fine. But the brown-haired man didn't understand why he should be the one to pedal, since he had a sore fifth point after the recent one. The older one could switch places with the younger one, of course, but the problem was that he had anger control issues and could break the bike in the process if they were attacked by monsters. In the end, Hohen pedaled as hard as he could, while Yunwan sat in the back, waving his bag of bricks, and he had already killed 4 monsters and was getting tired of it. The problem was that this model of bike couldn't go any faster, no matter how hard the brown man tried. And at that moment, another zombie student approached them. Yenwon asked Hoen to go faster and more carefully, but the guy could do neither the former nor the latter. Plus, the zombies wouldn't leave them alone. What happened next was worse, as the bike hit a corpse and fell over. So Unwon grabbed Junior's hand and they ran towards the building, with a whole bunch of monsters chasing after him. In vain, Hoen looked back, for there he saw dozens of zombies and realized that he had miscalculated the situation, and now it was either pan or lost. It wasn't that far to the building, so the brunette asked his friend to only run forward and not to look back. The problem was that the older man was also here for the first time, so he didn't know how they would get into the building. So the only idea he had was to climb the Zauber to buy some time. So, from their last strength, the protagonists climbed over the fence, after which they fell on the sidewalk and began breathing heavily while there was time to do so. It could be considered that they had accomplished the first part of the plan as they had reached the main building. Now they had to figure out how to get into the building. There was also a high probability that they would not be welcome there. At this point, they were noticed by one of the survivors in the building. He started trying to open the door, but he was making a lot of noise while doing so Hoen asked him to open the door more quietly. Practically breaking down the door, a tall and strong athlete appeared in the opening, glaring at the guys at the entrance. Despite his very imposing and formidable appearance, the first thing the guy did was ask the protagonists to give him permission to hug them. The guy noticed that the main characters were very exhausted, so he offered to carry them one by one to safety, reminding them of a huge, kindly bear. Together, they entered the main building and walked down a corridor where the corpses of dead monsters lay. Hoen noticed that the athlete was wearing a uniform that wasn't their university's. The brown-haired man's assumptions were correct. It turned out that athletes from different universities had a joint training session over winter break. On the stairs, Hoen almost fell because the steps were slippery with blood, so his new acquaintance asked him to be extremely careful. The atmosphere upstairs was quite unusual. No one was shouting, no one was threatening others. Everyone was behaving decently, culturally discussing something. Hoen watched everyone and didn't understand why they were so calm, since the main gate was just a short walk away, though it didn't look like they had any communication with the outside world. And here Yunwan started acting weird. He asked the brown-haired man to ask him something, because the stranger is inundated with questions, but he always gets a yes or no answer because he's always very scared. Obviously, the brunette was jealous as he thought the student from another university liked the guy, as he would be able to protect him from the monsters since he was big and strong. At this point, the leader of this group of survivors approached them and said that he would first lead them to a room where they could get some respite from the road. The young man led the protagonists to the restroom and said that this building was completely safe because they had made every effort and were able to clear all the floors of zombies, although on their part there were also casualties. But everyone agreed that it was possible to survive only in this way. Unwon listened glumly to the guy who said that this was the biggest building in the university, and it was just in the center of the campus, so they had a chance to wait for help. So, the leader of the group first of all showed the main characters the room where medicines and weapons were stored, then said that they lived on the 3rd floor. The 1st and 2nd floor were empty. Also on this floor, half of the rooms were empty, so the guys could occupy any of them. Water was distributed every day downstairs at noon, but if you save money, there was enough for drinking and washing. It sounded unbelievable, but it was simple. They collected snow and drowned it, using this water for their own purposes. Besides, there was still a stockpile of water that they managed to make before the water supply was cut off. Hoen admitted he didn't expect to see such organization, and the group leader wondered how things were in other buildings. When Hoen said that fighting was a frequent occurrence in other places, the guy assured that it simply wasn't the case here, since they had everything going on and everyone was doing their part. The protagonists were left alone in the room. Hoen thought that everything was fine. They had survived, there was food, water, weapons, but Yunwan was not so optimistic. The brunette started eating the chocolate bar, saying he didn't believe in the goodness of these people. The younger one leaned over to him and also said he didn't really believe them and thought there was something wrong here. At some point, Yunwan set the chocolate bar aside and said that the younger boy was finally ripe to ask him a question. except that the brown-haired man didn't understand how the conversation could once again drift into intimate topics and not about the current situation. This time, Hoenn wanted to slow down now, not so much because he didn't want to continue, rather the opposite, but because he could no longer blame Enwin alone for what was happening between them. He himself wanted it just as much. So to restrain himself, he pushed his partner away and asked his opinion of their new acquaintances. The truth was that Yunwan didn't know anything either, since he was in this building for the first time in all the cycles. But he had seen some of these people in the gym one cycle. First of all, it concerned the local leader, but in the gym he looked, or rather behaved, differently. So the brunette did not immediately remember him, but the clothes helped. It was strange for the older man to see athletes in green uniforms here playing house games, for last time he remembered them at the moment when they were mobbing a man. Hoenn sat down next to the brunette and asked him about the possibility that these guys had changed. But it was zero, because Yunwan had learned very well during this time that a place could change, but not the essence of a person. The brunette stroked his friend's cheek and said that the guy was always getting into trouble because of his kindness and desire to help other people. So all these people were only seemingly kind and normal, but as soon as the opportunity presented itself, they would show their rotten selves. So he asked the brown-haired man not to trust anyone. The guys further shared their opinions about the situation. It was obvious that these people weren't surprised when they arrived, which said that there were quite often new people here. But there were no injured people among them, and everyone was too calm. Hoenn realized that all the guys were in great physical shape, but if they had not long ago reclaimed the hull, there had to be signs of fatigue. So he came to the conclusion that wounded didn't belong here. Although it sounded creepy, it was more believable. The brunette looked at Janet rather strangely, as he was surprised at the conclusion he had just come to. Plus, Yunwan was willing to give the younger boy free rein, and he was willing to do anything but set himself up for death. For the older Hoenn was the main character, because as long as the guy is alive, he is alive, and vice versa. For the brown-haired man, it was different. In his world, an understanding. Yunwan was the main character who overcomes all the difficulties, and he himself was assigned the role of a secondary character who blindly follows the main one. Hoenn didn't understand why it was his death that was bringing his friend back in time. The older man assumed that Hoenn was a very important person. Suddenly, Enwin plowed Hoenn to the floor. His actions were more eloquent than words. When the brunette got to the younger man's body, there was a knock on the door from Hanbin, who had brought them some useful doors and waited for it to be opened. Hoenn opened the door and pretended to be happy to see the guy who had brought them some towels, pills, and a few other little things. But Yunwan reprimanded the room. On one hand, it was nice that they were taken care of too. But on the other, he had a strange and inescapable feeling that things would soon change. Hanbin also said that it was time for the guys to go to the lobby as they would be handing out food there. In general, supplies were handed out twice every day at the same time, so it was impossible to be late. Right now, Hanbin couldn't lead them into the lobby as he had other things to do. The guys went down to the lobby and each got their own portion of food, but the brunette ate it all too quickly, as the portion was small. At that moment, Changmin came over to them and said that they had cleaned out all the stores in the area and were now cooking small portions of food for everyone. He also said that Hanbin was busy today, so he wouldn't be able to eat. But not only will the guy not be able to eat today, but also the next 2 days, as he has to collect snow for everyone and drown it so there will be water. And it was also a punishment for breaking the front door on the first floor. Changmin thought he had done the right thing, since if someone violated the rules of this place or didn't work, they would receive punishment, up to and including expulsion from this building. At that moment, Hoenn realized that this was exactly what Enwin was talking about. People don't change. There were probably no fair criteria for punishments, and they were handed out left and right as a sign of intimidation. Suddenly, one of the students asked Changmin if it was really worth going to such lengths, since the rollers were only slightly deformed and their functionality was not compromised. Changmin immediately changed his face and demanded the curator of this guy, who himself had come from nowhere and was trying to insert his own 5 cents on the carpet. Changmin beat the guy up and demanded that he call everyone above him for a preventative talk. Hoenn watched carefully what was happening and tried to make sense of it all. Suddenly he realized that this was a demonstration, also for him. Since the breakdown of the rollers was also the fault of the newcomers, They, along with Hanbin, would have to go on duty tomorrow in a group of 4. Plus, Changmin hoped that Hoen realized that it was better for them to be friends. Since the leader of the group had been too close to the brown-haired man up to that point, the brunette didn't like it and punched the man in the face, telling him not to touch his friend. Unwon was ready to even kill Changmin for such insolence, but instead he could call everyone else over to watch him beat the crap out of him and become the new leader of the group. Changmin was startled and walked away, and the brunette caught his partner's sizzling gaze. Yes, he was pleased at such concern, but now they had to wait for a setup and a knife in the back. Hoen wasn't upset about it. He looked out the window and realized that the first thing they needed to do was to get Hanbin on their side and then break through to the main gate. Meanwhile, Hanbin was back in the building. He was walking down the hallway and realized he wanted to eat. And just then, Hoen pulled him by the arm into a corner. The athlete was about to talk about work, but the brown-haired man handed him a black bag, saying he must be hungry. There was some food inside. A snack was the only way Hoen could thank the athlete for saving his life, so he could eat whatever was in the bag. After eating, Hanbin explained to the guys that their task for today was to wait for one more person and go to the upper floors. If there were monsters there, then kill them and take the useful items. This building had 7 floors, 3 of which had already been cleaned up. Today, their group was going to the 4th floor where they would have to inspect 2 rooms. It turned out that Genkwan had come here from the research building, but not the one where the incident happened. Nevertheless, the guy had heard that during the night, someone had cranked up the temperature and light over the virus samples, causing it to start mutating. The surprising thing was that it had gotten out of control abnormally fast. The time for talking was over as they arrived at the 4th floor. Unwon and Hoen, like the rest of the guys, decided to check out the different rooms. Hoen was the first one unlucky enough to run into the monster, so he didn't hesitate to hit it over the head with the bat. He hoped there was only one monster in the room, but he was wrong, and there was another one coming at him. Only it was slow and had no arms. At that moment, Enwin ran into the room. He was saying that they needed to get out of here as he had a premonition that their group's strength wouldn't be enough to kill all the zombies here. They ran towards the exit. There were many both dead and living zombies around. One of them crushed Gunghwan, and the younger one started asking the older one to help his new acquaintance. They really were in huge trouble now, as they made a mess on the floor and a mob of monsters fell from one of the rooms. Unwon realized that there was no way out but to interrupt them all. The battle was brutal as always, but as long as the guys stayed alive. But now it was really time for them to get out of the way. But before that, they had to lift the cupboard that had fallen on Gengwan, because there was no other way to get him out of there. But the cupboard was too heavy, and they couldn't do anything about it. But H-Pen Bin came to the rescue and single-handedly managed to lift this heavy cabinet. They had no time for surprise, and the guy had to be pulled out before the zombies came running. Hanbin was breathing heavily. He recognized that he had made a mistake in thinking this place was safe, but it was far from it. There were other members of the group waiting for them downstairs, who didn't like the fact that the guys had come back so quickly. And besides, one of them was badly injured. Hoen asked the leader for bandages and medicine to administer first aid to Gengwan, but he started by opening his backpack and dumping the contents on the floor, then said that since they had brought so few supplies, but to help them tran resources. The young man refused to believe what was happening, and Changmin explained that it was their own fault, as they had not obtained food, medicine, or weapons for the group, but instead had brought in a mortally wounded man and demanded that they help him. But no one was going to do that. Unwon now saw the whole picture. There were no wounded here as they were either fed to zombies or buried at night in the courtyard, so it was obvious that the leader of the group was a trademark psychopath. Too many unnecessary and vile things Changmin had managed to say, so even the patient and kind Hoen couldn't stand it and punched him in the face. The leader of the group looked less and less like a leader with a broken nose, but Unwon and Hanbin were though surprised, but happy about this turn of events. But with this behavior, the protagonist untied the hands of the psycho, and he began to beat him, since he did not like the guy from the beginning. However, the brown-haired man wasn't going to take the beating. He punched back as he believed that they were human after all, and had no right to behave in such a manner with an injured person. In the heat of the fight, Changmin noticed that there was a zombie bite on Hoen's arm, something he didn't expect to see on his own arm. At this point, the guy summoned the rest of the group, informing them that there was a bitten man among them, which meant he had to be beaten to a pulp and then isolated from everyone else. Yenwon froze. He couldn't take his eyes off the beating of his youngest. Hoen was tied up and led under escort to a separate room, but he could not remember when he was wounded. They planned to lock the young man in a closet because if they killed him now, he would stain everything with his blood, so they decided to do it later. Hoen didn't really care what these guys thought, but he didn't want to die after all. He had made a promise to Unwon and he wanted to keep it, and here it all spiraled. He didn't want to believe this was the end. Unwon was finally able to find his youngest. He opened the doors to the closet and looked very scared. The brunette immediately began to untie the younger boy, though he resisted, and the other boys thought that he had signed his own verdict. As soon as Hoen got a chance to speak, he began to chase the brunette away, as he didn't want to hurt him. But Unwon didn't listen to the guy's tantrum. He just hugged him tightly, as he wasn't going to leave him alone with this pain. Once Hoen calmed down a bit, the older man kissed him affectionately. Only now did the brown-haired man begin to understand Unwon's true feelings. So he hugged him tightly, as he realized that he had made a promise that was extremely difficult to keep. The older one had very deep feelings for his younger one, so he made a decision to be by his side till his last breath. So he asked him not to cry. Meanwhile, death was getting closer and closer to them. Hoen was hot and cold at first, and then he felt very drowsy, so he pressed himself harder against his partner. But Unwon asked him not to fall asleep. It's amazing that Hoen used to be able to stay awake for 24 hours while doing his assignments for uni. But now it's only been one day, and he can't resist this state. Unwon admitted that he hadn't answered the guy's questions earlier. Not because he didn't want to, but because everything in his head was confused, and he had completely forgotten what kind of person he was before all these events. Surprisingly, but such an important moment, the guy remembered that he likes strawberries, and also cakes and different juices. In a word, he likes everything that does not have bitterness. For the first time, Hoen knew what his partner liked. But he was dying, and he could feel the tears on his cheeks from the brunette who was desperately asking him not to forget about him. The young man did not understand why Hoen had deceived him again, why he was dying, why he was leaving him alone with this hellish pain of shared memories that he himself would forget in the morning. In the first cycle, Hoen went down to the first floor alone on campus, but there were too many monsters below, so he couldn't dodge and was injured. At that moment, he did not want to die alone. He wanted to hear at least once more the voices of his relatives. However, he couldn't let the rest of the guys survive this, so he decided by radio to inform them that they were not to go down as death awaited them there. Even though he was trying to do the right thing and help the others, he cried as he didn't want to die alone. But if even one person would remember his existence, his life and sacrifice would not be in vain. Hoen was cold, hurt, scared. He didn't want to die, and that's when Enwon came to him. On one hand, the younger boy wanted to chase the brunette away since it was dangerous here. But on the other hand, he was glad that this minute he wasn't alone. Now the situation was repeating itself. The boys had been sleeping on the floor of the closet for some time. Hoen was the first to wake up and saw Enwon's handsome face in front of him. He was trying to figure out what kind of dream he had just had. At this point, Unwon had already woken up and was looking at his partner, who was asking for forgiveness for everything he had done and everything he hadn't done, and almost professing his love. And a moment later, the brunette pinned the younger boy to the floor with his body without saying a word. Only in this experimental way did it become clear that the young man was alive and had not turned into a zombie. It was a miracle, for the guy remembered perfectly well that he had been bitten, and the pain was hellish afterward. But he should have turned by now. Suddenly, Hoen started asking Unwon about how he had died before. It turned out it had been various ways, but never after conversion. The guys were discussing what happened. It turned out all the times before that Hoen had died before potentially turning into a monster, except that Unwon didn't understand how it was related, that he relived this nightmare over and over again, after each death of a friend. Apparently, Hoken's body had antibodies that could counteract the virus. Up to this point, Hoen had already been thinking about how the whole situation resembled a game where if you didn't complete the main task, you were back to square one. So if he's the key to preventing the zombie apocalypse, then after each of his deaths, everything will go back to the beginning. This kind of statement began to piss off Unwon, as he thought that death was not to be trifled with. But Hoen didn't joke, even though he realized that his words sounded like nonsense. Nevertheless, one had to pull oneself together, as the younger boy didn't understand why it was Unwon's role to protect him. The brunette calmed down and hugged his Hoenn tightly. He apologized, as he didn't want to take out his anger on him. The young man deeply did not care scientifically about what had happened or not, for the main thing was that Hoenn was alive and remembered him. The main characters were happy, and for the first time ever, Hoenn was the first to kiss Unwon. Only to go further than kissing, the boys were prevented by a knock on the door. Someone was trying to open it, so Unwon rallied to defend his youngest. The doors to the closet opened and Hanbin walked in, who was being strangled by Unwon. But Hoenn ran to the guys with all his legs and asked them to stop. So Hoenn didn't let his friend kill the athlete and wanted to listen to what he would tell them. But here the new acquaintance's affectionate address to the Madsenkoi took the brunette out of his mind. Hanbin was indeed sent to check on the guys. By idea, they should have been zombies by now, but the guy saw the protagonists in front of him completely alive. The athlete blushed as he was glad to see that the guys were okay, especially Hoenn, as he was a kind and good man. At this point, other guys approached the back room as they wanted to help Hanbin kill the main characters. Hoenn looked at Unwon, asking the guy what they should do, since it could be shown that they were still alive, but the brunette thought those guys didn't care if they were humans or monsters. Hanbin was in complete agreement with this, as he too understood that to those guys, they were a threat to the orders of their organization. The sportsman suggested that the guys hide for now and keep quiet. As soon as there was an opportunity, he would release them. And there was generally confusion outside due to the large number of newcomers. Except Unwon had other plans, as he realized that there were guys outside the door who were eavesdropping on their conversation. The brunette was beating up the guys while Hanbin dragged him away. But Unwon wanted to kill them, as he was well aware either he would kill them or they would bring everyone else and kill them already. Yes, and pissed off these brunette people as they treated his youngest like a monster. At this point, the rest of the group came in. Chungmin stared at the bitten Hoenn and didn't understand why the guy was fine and still alive. And then something began to happen that no one expected. Behind Chungmin's back stood Hoenn's girlfriends, and one of them, with all her might, hit the leader with her knee on the causal place. The guy was bent in half from the pain and collapsed to the floor. Seizing the moment, Hoenn grabbed the girl's arm and ordered her and her friend, as well as the brunette and the athlete, to run away from here as fast as they could. So they hid on the 4th floor, in the room where Hoenn was attacked by the monster. The students were unlikely to run after them, so they could take a breather. Even though they were all in a bad situation, the girls were glad that the guys survived and they got a chance to meet again. But they had a problem, as looking out the window they saw dozens of police, ambulances, and fire trucks with no people. Nevertheless, Hoenn wanted them all to survive, as he had something to say to Unwon. Shaitan thought about it. He realized that they could only rely on themselves, so sitting on their asses would not work, because then they would die either from starvation or infection. At that moment, Chpenbin approached Hoenn. As he had one request about Gangwon, he asked him to take the guy with him. Yenwon was well aware that even if he suggested leaving the magistrate here, Hoenn would still run to save him. Hanbin was happy about the decision to pick up Gangwon, plus the guy kept his car keys with him all the time, which was parked in the backyard. Hoenn perked up even more as the car was an SUV that could hold 6 people, plus it had a full tank. Meanwhile, the bad guys were waiting for them with bats on the stairs. They thought that the guys would soon flee from there, as they wouldn't last long without water and food. There were indeed footsteps coming from upstairs, but they weren't guys. They were hungry zombies. That was Hoenn's brilliant plan. He led a whole crowd of zombies chasing him down. The courage and bravado of Changmin and company was blown away. He was terrified and thought Hoenn was a real nutcase. While the zombies were feasting, guys and girls were looking at this disgusting picture from the top floor. The boys then went down the safe stairs and found Gangkwon unconscious in the restroom. Next, Hanbin picked the guy up and was about to carry him to his car, and one of the girls found the car keys in the magistrate's pocket. They reached the door. Yenwon warned that everyone should run forward without looking back. He would cover the rear. That's how they ended up on the street and got to the car. Hoenn was going to ride in the front seat. Unwon sat behind the wheel and warned everyone right away that the car would shake a lot since the road was bad and there were a lot of monsters. The car wasn't just shaking. It was skidding on every corner, and Hoenn asked the older man to drive more carefully. The young man looked out the window and realized that the situation around was worse than he thought. But on the plus side, the car started to pick up speed. The girls had a very logical question. What was the government doing, since the situation had gotten so bad? Plus, there was not a single person in the place that friends or relatives could contact. Hoenn speculated that it was a matter of secrecy, as this virus was classified and no one had heard of it in scientific circles until now. The number of monsters grew larger by the minute as they began to drive up to the laboratory where everything happened. Yunwon's mood changed drastically, and he almost lost control of the car, and then asked again if it was really the lab in front of them. The young man realized that it was his fault for what had happened to them all, as he was the one who had done something to the control panel without knowing what it was or how it worked. Hoenn tried by all means to bring his partner to his senses, as he felt that this was just a lingering nightmare, and they all needed to be patient a little longer. Whatever and how. But this was a nightmare they couldn't avoid, and they had to face it, even though it looked too unreal. Plus, now they had another problem. Since the car had stopped, it attracted the attention of the zombies and they all started running towards it. Hoenn realized that his friend had picked himself up and was ready to ride forward, pushing his way through the crowd of monsters. Quite quickly, they reached the main gate. But the problem was that the exit was blocked by other cars, and there were monsters snooping around. This all said that the government knew about the situation at the university, but did nothing. Hoenn wasn't going to give up, nor was he going to die in this place. So he got out of the car and said there was a gap near the fence where you could squeeze through to the outside world. So, they were spotted by the monsters. Hoenn asked Hanbin to carry Gangwon in the indicated direction, and he himself started asking Yunwon to get out of the car quickly. It was obvious that the older man's head was full of all sorts of strange thoughts, so Hoenn stayed with him, trying to coax him to open the door and get out of the car. The brunette was really going to sacrifice himself to save the others, as he thought they would be perfectly safe outside the gate. Hoenn didn't understand his elder. He only smiled bitterly and said that he was probably the one who had touched the virus control panel. So this whole nightmare was his doing. The guy took the pipe and started smashing the windshield in the car. Only now he realized how the older man felt all those cycles of rebirth. Truthfully, he wasn't going to give him the opportunity to punish himself with death. Tears came to Hoenn's eyes. He couldn't accept the fact that Unwon had given up on him, that he was abandoning him, that he believed this nonsense. During this time, Hoenn met a lot of bad people who only pretended to help each other, but actually killed anyone who got in their way. But the older man blamed and punished himself even though he wasn't to blame. So he asked him to go with him to the store near the bus station to buy strawberry juice. This tipped the scales in Hoenn's favor. So Yunwon got out of the car and said that now they needed to run fast as there were many obstacles ahead. But if they tried their best, they could survive. Meanwhile, the girls had already reached the wall, and there everything turned out to be just as the main character had said. Nahi climbed into the hole first, since she was the smallest of them all. On the other side, she had to pull everyone else down on top of her. The girl did her best, and found herself in the snowy woods on the other side of the fence. Behind Nahi, all the others had crawled through the hole, and now they were following one by one through the woods. They walked for quite a while until they reached a spot from which they could see a barbed wire fence below, with soldiers walking around the perimeter. Hoenn covered the girl's mouth with his hand, as he realized, unlike her, that it wasn't over yet. So he asked everyone to be quiet and look carefully at the roadblock. The bottom was full of the corpses of the students who had gotten to this place first. But all of them had been killed by the soldiers, yet none of them were zombies. It was clear from the traces of blood on the snow, so going downstairs was suicide. They had to find another way to escape. But at this moment, Hoenn noticed that Hanbin was already falling down from fatigue. He could no longer walk as he had no strength left to do so. He was going to take a break here and only then try to catch up with the main group. But they were in the mountains where it was quickly getting dark, and they had no food or warm clothes. We could have gone for it, except that the soldiers spotted them and started shooting to kill. There was obviously a sniper working on them, so Yenwen asked everyone to duck down and keep quiet, so it would be harder to spot them. Except that he himself was already wounded, so he fell right into Hoenn's arms, shot in the leg and more. Hoenn asked his friend to stand up, but he didn't have the strength to do so. Meanwhile, they began to be surrounded by soldiers who thought they were all infected. The soldiers had orders to destroy everyone on the spot. Yunwon even experienced some kind of satisfaction as this nightmare would end, and he wouldn't have to go through all of this anymore. Hoenn didn't want to listen to all this nonsense, so he tried to carry the older man on his back. for he remembered their shared promise. They left bloody footprints in the snow, but the brown-haired man did not give up, as he wanted to save the man he loved by all means. However, they didn't have much chance to survive, as they were followed by soldiers who were going to shoot them on the spot. Somehow, in some unfathomable way, Hoenn fooled the Voic and was able to take one of them hostage while asking the others not to shoot them, but to help. It turned out that the soldiers were told that there were no living people in the university, and everyone there was infected. But Hoenn claimed they weren't bitten. The girls and Hanbin also came out of the ambush and asked to help the dying man. Hoenn prayed. Meanwhile, the soldiers reported the situation to their superiors, but they were clearly told to kill everyone who came out of the university. But the guards said these guys knew how to fight this virus. Thus, the soldiers brought the boys to the city. Hoenn lay in the hospital, and beside him sat his sister and wept for joy that he was alive. The girl said that all the relatives of the students were told that everyone at the uni had died, so she was very happy that her brother was alive. But she had already been asked to leave the ward as visiting time was over. Hoenn was only allowed to see his sister because he promised to keep his mouth shut, and his every word or action was closely monitored. Now, every day, the guy was tortured with different procedures, as it was necessary to create a vaccine. But the nurse did not know how far the specialists had advanced in this case. Evening came, and Hoenn walked out into the hallway. He still felt like he was in that nightmare, for he could not explain to anyone in the world what had happened in that creepy place. True, there was one person who could understand him, and that was the brown-haired man who came to his room. Yenwen opened his eyes and saw Hoenn lying next to him, curious as to how he had slept all this time. At first, they hugged tightly, but then the brunette noticed that his friend was constantly sighing. The thing was that just being around the older man made the brown-haired man feel like they had escaped from that nightmare. And then Hoenn kissed his dear elder. The guys knew that there had been a recent report that said that waste disposal had released a virus that had infected the students. Meanwhile, the clock struck midnight. Hoenn hugged the older man and wished him a happy birthday. At that moment, they both realized that there would be no more repetition of the nightmare. Plus, Hoenn had confessed his love to Unwen, and now they could move on with their lives in peace, just as they had dreamed before.